Toledo, Ohio, January 27, 1992. At midnight, a call came in to the local taxi company reporting that 3 unidentified individuals had attacked a taxi driver in the parking lot of the University of Toledo student housing. The caller also mentioned hearing gunshots. The call was redirected to the 911 rescue service, and from there to the University of Toledo officers. 2 colleagues, Joseph Green and Jeffrey Hodge, immediately headed to the specified location. It was quiet and peaceful there, the ground covered in snow, with no signs of the crime that had occurred. Neither the taxi, nor the driver, nor the assailants were noticeable. Nevertheless, the 2 colleagues decided to look around, to walk around the entire parking area. Lighting their way with flashlights, the 2 officers turned the corner of the building and saw the body. It was a girl, lying face down in the snow. The unusual position of her body stood out. Her hands were placed neatly at her sides, palms up. People don't usually fall like that. The victim was without a coat, her dark blue sweater pulled up, and her jeans and underwear pulled down, fully exposing the midsection of her body. And in those areas of exposed skin, bullet holes were visible. There was also a bullet wound on the back of her head. The most obvious assumption, considering the appearance of the girl's clothing, was that she had been attacked with the intent of sexual violence. The victim didn't have any documents with her, but on the same evening, her roommate reported her disappearance. The victim's name was Melissa Ann Herstrom. Melissa was a 19-year-old student at the University of Toledo, studying to become a nurse. Melissa stood out among other students. She was very beautiful, cheerful, with dark wavy hair and distinctive bright lipstick that emphasized her vivacity and zest for life. Melissa had no enemies, especially not ones who would wish her harm. She wanted to have children and believed she would be a wonderful mother. No one doubted this, knowing what a sincere and kind person she was. She had so much to offer to the world, but she was prevented from doing so in the most callous way. Meanwhile, detectives from the Toledo City Homicide Department were investigating the crime scene. Shell casings were scattered everywhere, and some bullets had passed through the victim's body and into the frozen ground, so the detectives decided to dig them up along with the soil. Interestingly, one of the casings appeared as if it had been split in half by something. Additionally, not far from the crime scene, officers found a set of keys in a trash bin, and notably, among them were keys to a Ford Taurus. Police discovered the Ford approximately a kilometer from the girl's murder site, in a parking lot. What was intriguing was that the crime scene, the trash bin where the keys were found, and the parking lot were 3 different points on the campus map, and the detectives had to connect these points into a cohesive whole. The coroner took Melissa's body to conduct an autopsy. The examination revealed that Melissa had been shot 14 times at close range with a 9mm handgun. She was shot in the back of the head, causing her to fall to the ground, with her hands likely tied behind her back. Then, the killer fired another 13 bullets, shooting her in the back and descending to her legs. It was an incredibly brutal murder, as such a number of bullets was completely excessive. The pathologist ruled out the possibility of sexual assault. There was not the slightest sign of violence. However, she was partly undressed. This means the killer either aimed to humiliate her or wanted to see the damage caused by bullets hitting her exposed body. There was no alcohol or drugs in her system. She was completely sober. Marks on her wrists indicated that at some point she was immobilized with something, resembling handcuff marks. The detectives had no choice but to ask themselves who would use handcuffs. Primarily, representatives of law enforcement, or someone pretending to be a policeman. It wouldn't be the first time a killer, pretending to be a policeman, stopped a victim's car and committed a crime. Handcuffs are a means of control, so their suspect is someone seeking complete control over their victims. The news of the murder of the student quickly spread throughout the university campus. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that shortly before the murder, an unknown individual began terrorizing one of the female dormitories. Someone opened fire in the building, firing 9 shots, which were later removed from the walls. Considering that these incidents occurred practically one after another, everyone assumed that they were connected, because such things had never happened before at the University of Toledo. Indeed, it was the first murder on campus in decades, and the students were horrified. Melissa's friends couldn't understand how this could happen, why, and who could have done it. Everyone loved her. It didn't make sense. There were 30 girls living in that dormitory, and they no longer felt safe. Someone called their parents, and they took them home. Melissa's friends were worried that they were in danger, but investigators believed that Melissa was the target because of the brutality of the crime, the 14 shots. When the killer kept shooting at a dead girl, it looked like a crime that could only happen in a fit of incredible rage. Detectives interviewed Melissa's friends about how she spent the evening of January 26th. It turned out that she met up with a friend from the university's women's club, sorority, after which she planned to return home. However, someone called her and informed her that her boyfriend, JR, was spending time with another girl. so Melissa went to the parking lot adjacent to where JR lived. From there, she would be able to see when he returned home and with whom. It was for this reason that the police's initial suspicion fell on her boyfriend. Jealousy and anger often become the motives behind many thoughtless acts, especially since the 14 bullets fired into the immobilized girl indicated the rage of the attacker. Melissa's boyfriend, JR, stated that he was indeed with another girl at his home that evening. He didn't see Melissa and had no idea that someone had informed her of his infidelity. However, things were not as simple as they seemed. Investigators found out that Melissa's personal life was more complicated than it appeared at first glance because she was hiding her new relationship from her ex-boyfriend, Kenny. Kenny was a very volatile person, the kind who gets into fights in bars, can punch a wall in anger, and yell threats in fits of rage. Naturally, the question arose of what Kenny would do if he found out about Melissa's new relationship. Thus, the police suddenly had two suspects, the unfaithful boyfriend and the aggressive ex-boyfriend. Both were invited for questioning. They answered questions candidly, sincerely wanting to help the investigation, passed polygraph tests, and had alibis, meaning neither of them had any connection to the crime. However, now that both guys had been ruled out as suspects and no new ones emerged, panic began to spread throughout the university campus. Everyone understood that it still could be a random murder, and fear gripped the University of Toledo. A pair of girls from the women's dormitory reported receiving strange, threatening calls. It was the same dormitory where the unknown assailant had fired shots. The girls were so terrified that university officers escorted them to and from their classes. Since no one suspected who the killer was or why he targeted Melissa, everyone wondered who would be next, fearing that the killer could emerge from around any corner at any moment. Despite this, everyone had to continue studying and working. The detectives, contemplating their next move, noticed similarities between Melissa's murder and recent victims of a serial killer. In Los Angeles, the killer, dubbed the Mountain Strangler by the police, had murdered 10 young women and left their bodies in the mountains along the highway. Sometimes serial killers pose as police officers because it's so easy to set up a flashing light for a car, stop the victim, abduct, and kill. However, this version seemed too far-fetched. Therefore, with no suspects and feeling the tension from the growing panic on campus, the investigators returned to square one. More precisely, it was the call to the taxi dispatch when the caller reported that robbers had attacked a taxi driver. Detectives investigating Melissa's case decided to trace the call and found out that it came from a campus service building, which was locked on weekends, meaning the caller must have had keys. What did this reveal to the investigators? It indicated that the killer had keys to the locked facility. Meanwhile, the victim's hands were likely bound with handcuffs, typically positioned behind the back as police are taught. Reluctantly, the investigators had to admit the obvious. It wasn't a serial killer posing as a police officer, but an actual police officer. Detectives decided to speak with Joseph Green and Jeffrey Hodge again, the two officers from the University of Toledo who found the body. Perhaps they had overlooked some evidence. In fact, both officers had very positive reputations. Joseph was a friendly young man who told silly jokes and was just a pleasant guy. Jeffrey Hodge was also a quiet, modest man who had recently gotten married. He loved his job, was a bit of a Boy Scout, always eager to help, and had previously worked as a 911 dispatcher. He was very eager to contribute to the investigation. Detectives decided to start by questioning Joseph Green because he was the one who found the body and wrote the report. On that day, around 7 o'clock in the evening, it was snowing heavily. The girl had left her friend's place before the snowfall, meaning when Melissa and her killer appeared at the crime scene, there was already snow, and there should have been footprints in the snow. However, according to Joseph Green's report, there were no shoe prints on the ground, only freshly fallen snow. This obvious discrepancy with the facts puzzled the detectives because it was unclear why the police officers went to inspect the area at all if the snow was untouched and there were no footprints leading there. Moreover, they were the ones who found Melissa's keys in the trash bin. What prompted them to look into the trash bin? There was something else that puzzled the investigators. Joseph said, "When I saw the body, I knew she was dead." The investigator was surprised and asked how that was possible. Joseph replied that his family owned a funeral business and he had seen many dead bodies. While these weren't incriminating pieces of evidence, the combined facts urged the investigators to dig deeper. Forensic investigators examined both officers' cars who were on duty that night. They were looking for physical evidence that could tie Melissa to one of the patrol cars. They couldn't find any fingerprints, but they discovered a green wool thread that matched the girl's coat. Additionally, they found a long hair on the seat. At that time, they couldn't conduct DNA comparison on the hair, but it matched the color of the victim's hair. These were more indirect pieces of evidence, but still significant. Officer Joseph wrote a report in which inconsistencies were noted. Now, with the evidence found, the hair and thread in the patrol car, the evidence against Officer Joseph Green began to accumulate one after another like a snowball. He became the main suspect in the investigation. Detectives kept an eye on him, showing up at his house in the middle of the night to collect discarded trash, trying to find something that could link him to the crime. Ultimately, detectives decided to polygraph all officers involved in the case. Joseph Green was the first to be tested, but his test came out clean. Therefore, they had to leave him alone. The only thing that continued to bother the police was his certainty about the absence of shoe prints. Usually, when a police officer sees someone in distress, they rush to them immediately, and that's probably what Green did. So he probably wasn't certain, but insisted on the absence of shoe prints, making detectives suspect him. With Joseph Green, his partner Jeffrey Hodge arrived. Nobody suspected him, but it was decided to polygraph everyone just in case. Before Melissa's body was found, and before Jeffrey started his night shift, he watched the Super Bowl with friends, including other officers. Jeffrey, for some reason, seemed nervous, asking about ballistics, how long a body can remain under certain conditions before decomposition, what it's like to see a body, essentially asking quite strange questions. He also turned on the homeowner's radio on the police frequency. Of course, friends asked him what he was doing, to which he replied that he just wants to know what's going on before going to work. Now, at the station, waiting for the results of his partner's check, he opened up to one of the detectives and mentioned how funny it was to watch the girls from the women's dormitory running out into the street in light, translucent clothing when the fire alarm went off. Such conversations were not illegal, but clearly inappropriate and unbecoming for a married officer tasked with protecting these girls, especially considering it was the same dormitory where the girls were suffering from strange calls and gunshots. Nevertheless, Jeffrey went to the polygraph examiner next. As part of the preparation, he was asked various questions, such as what he considered the best thing that happened in his life, to which he answered, working as a police officer. Jeffrey had worked as an operator for the rescue service and had tried to get into various police departments until he was finally hired by the university. And for his graduation, his grandfather gave him a pistol. The polygraph examiner casually asked which one, and he replied, Smith & Wesson, the same type of pistol from which the fatal bullets could have been fired. The polygraph examiner tensed up but didn't show it, remembering that Jeffrey Hodgson had been at the crime scene and knew how the victim was dressed, the position of the body, and the shell casings found. The polygraph examiner had to work somewhat unusually and formulate a variety of similar questions. For example, was the victim bound with a belt, stockings, wire, tape, handcuffs? And here the polygraph showed how Jeffrey Hodgson clearly reacted to handcuffs. That was enough to cast doubt on him. The detectives asked him to show the pistol given to him by his grandfather. The man agreed and said it was in the locker at the university. But there was no weapon there, and Jeffrey claimed that someone wanted to set him up, which was strange. If someone really wanted to set him up, the gun would have been there. Instead, Jeffrey's handcuffs were confiscated. They were taken to the laboratory and examined under a microscope. Traces of copper and lead, metals associated with bullets, were found on them. Considering that one bullet had fragmented upon impact with something hard, these could well have been the handcuffs. And on their inner rim, specialists found a tiny fragment of skin. However, extracting DNA from such a tiny fragment was not easy at that time and required time. Jeffrey was arrested on February 1, 1992, 6 days after Melissa's murder. After his arrest, it suddenly became clear that he didn't seem like a nice guy to everyone around him. Girls recounted how he would stop them on fabricated pretexts, claiming they were drunk. Ann Collins was stopped by Jeffrey almost a day before Melissa's murder. She parked her car in an almost empty parking lot, and he pulled up behind her, blocking her. She hadn't been drinking, so she didn't understand why he was asking her about it. Fortunately, the persistence of the young officer seemed strange to her, and she talked to him without getting out of the car, just opening the window slightly. Anne feared and imagined what could have happened if her boyfriend hadn't shown up, with whom they were supposed to have breakfast together. She's sure she would have been Jeffrey Hodgson's first victim. But when her boyfriend appeared, Jeffrey quickly got back into his car and just drove away. Unfortunately, the next evening, he stopped another girl, Melissa Hurstrom, without any reason. The students were horrified when they learned the name of the arrested man. After all, Jeffrey had escorted them to classes when they were scared, told them he was working on the case, and everything would be fine. In other words, he presented himself as a knight in shining armor, although they were actually afraid of him. The case against Hodgson was built on circumstantial evidence until 3 weeks after his arrest, when the DNA test results came in. The fragment of skin on his handcuffs belonged to Melissa Hurstrom. In 1993, 18 months after the murder, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to the murder in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole. He limited his admission to just that and claimed he didn't remember anything about the crime itself. It's unlikely that this is true. He probably remembers every little detail. But even without his confession, detectives had a version of what happened to Melissa that evening. Jeffrey Hodge patrolled the area of the college campus. It wasn't his first time stopping pretty girls. Unfortunately, Melissa was alone on the street that evening. She wasn't drunk, but she was alone. She didn't have her driver's license with her, and instead of a warning or a fine, Jeffrey Hodge forced her to get into his car and drove her to the dormitory, where she got her license. He convinced her to take off her coat and put it on the back seat of the car so he could get a better look at her body. He was supposed to take her back to her car, but during the ride, he began to harass her. Melissa didn't like it, and she probably told him that such behavior would cost him his job. Another person might have ignored this, but not Jeffrey Hodge. A man who considered being a policeman the best thing that ever happened in his life didn't see himself in any other role. He drove the girl to a remote parking lot, pulled Melissa out of the car, frightened her, handcuffed her, and led her around the corner of the building. This is where he pulled down her clothes, humiliating her, and reached a point where he was horrified by what he had done and saw the only way out for himself in murder. And he shot the girl in the back of the head. Later, he called the dispatcher so he and his partner could answer the call and find the body. After all, he knew for sure that he had left footprints in the snow and needed an explanation of how they got there. He manipulated his partner, allowing him to find the body and write the report. Jeffrey Hodge also confessed to making threatening calls and shooting at the dormitory. He did this to once again respond to the call himself and appear a hero in the eyes of others. His cruelty quickly escalated, and it all ended with him killing a person. The former police captain, who headed the homicide department in 1992, said, in his opinion, Jeff Hodgson is a psychopath. It showed in how his crimes escalated. He believes if they hadn't caught him, he would have become a serial killer. He would have struck again. When he was formally dismissed in March 1992, representatives of the university found that he often stopped students, or rather female students, without informing the dispatcher. Once he called a girl's home several hours after arresting her for drunk driving, fabricated reports of robbery and an armed man on campus, as well as violated rules by waiting for students in bars outside the campus and following them to the student village, where he stopped them on suspicion of driving while intoxicated. It is believed that he made a call about a planned bombing against the university president and started fires, committing crimes that he himself investigated. He was not charged with other offenses investigated by the University of Toledo police. The prosecutor offered him a deal because the main evidence against him was DNA. They didn't even find his personal gun, from which he fired at the dormitory and at Melissa. But if today all jurors know what DNA is, and that it's practically a 100% guarantee that the accused is the real killer, in those years, DNA was new, just like a smeared fingerprint. The prosecutor was afraid that Jeffrey would be acquitted. At that time in Ohio, there was also no life sentence without the possibility of parole, as there is today. Therefore, he was sentenced to a term of 33 years to life, but considering the time he had already served in prison and his exemplary behavior, his first parole hearing was held on September 21, 2021. Melissa's family, her friends, and other people associated with the case, including Anna Collin, wrote letters to the parole board objecting to his release. About 400 letters were sent in total. When Jeffrey killed Melissa, he was only 22 years old. He was still relatively young and could commit more crimes if released. Furthermore, over the years, he never once contacted Melissa's family, never apologized, never attempted to explain what happened that night. Of course, his release was denied, and the next hearing will take place in 2031. The victim's family sued the university because the university administration hired Jeffrey and overlooked the numerous offenses he committed. The university paid the family $1 million, but it didn't make things easier for them. They never heard from Jeffrey Hodge what Melissa did to deserve such a fate. Although more than 30 years have passed, Melissa's university friends have not forgotten about her. A few years ago, they raised funds to create a cozy relaxation area at the university, where students can sit, relax, and remember Melissa, who once also studied at the University of Toledo, dreaming of becoming a nurse. But this was not allowed for her by a 22-year-old policeman with too high an opinion of himself, dreaming of becoming a hero, and instead of that, killing a girl whom he pledged to protect. Megan and Cherish DeSantis seemed destined to become best friends. The girls were born just a day apart, attended the same school, clubs, and activities together, and their parents thought each of them had 2 daughters. Both of their families were quite wealthy. Megan's father owned and managed a company specializing in drilling water wells. It had been a family business since the 1940s, bringing in around $2 million annually. However, by 1992, Megan's parents had divorced, and she lived with her mom, Shirley. As for Cherish's father, he was a well-known tobacco auctioneer in town and nationwide for over 30 years. While such auctions are not as common now back then, it was a thriving business. In the spring of 1992, 16-year-old Megan and Cherish were popular students at Thomasville High School in Georgia. Their families made sure their daughters behaved appropriately, although there was never a need for concern. The girls never caused trouble, excelled in their studies, and all their activities were within the bounds of propriety. Even during vacations, they looked forward to peaceful beach getaways rather than raucous parties. Thursday, March 26, 1992, marked the last day before spring break. After that, students could forget about school until April 6th. Megan and Cherish were eager to squeeze in some beach time. Not in Thomasville, of course, but in Florida, less than 60 kilometers away. For Thomasville students, crossing the border to visit the beaches of Tallahassee was a common practice. It took about 2 hours and the trip was quite enjoyable. The young women preferred a single beach that wasn't overrun by tourists. It was called Bold Point, a picturesque 13-kilometer shoreline, popular for birdwatching, wildlife, and yes, alligators, hence its name. Overall, it was a wonderful spot to relax under the sun and take a swim. That was Megan and Cherish's plan. Therefore, at 10 o'clock on Friday morning, the girls packed their swimsuits, towels, and, hopping into Megan's new Honda, headed for Florida, planning to spend the entire day at the beach. They intended to return home that same evening. Some of their friends were supposed to join them, but at the last moment, some had second thoughts or urgent matters came up. The girls arrived at Alligator Point Beach around noon. Megan parked the car, they grabbed their towels, changed into their bikinis, and turned on the rock station on the boombox. After wandering leisurely along the beach for a few hours, a married couple noticed the girls and, seeing that they were resting in a somewhat unusual pose, one girl lying on top of the other, decided not to disturb them. The couple veered wide around them to avoid causing any disturbance. However, on their way back, they realized that the girls hadn't moved at all. Even as they openly stared at them for minutes, the girls remained still. The man asked his wife to stay put while he approached them closer. He saw blood and shouted to his wife that the girls appeared to be dead and they needed to call the police. Alligator Point Beach was a family-friendly beach where visitors enjoyed walks and picnics. The police were aware that there had never been attacks on women at this beach. Therefore, the arriving officers were also horrified by what had happened. The ongoing contrast of the radio continuing to play rock music added to the chilling atmosphere of the murder scene juxtaposed against the carefree beach setting. The officers found the girls' identification and conducted a preliminary identification. They were 16-year-old Megan and Cherish. In addition to their documents, all their belongings were nearby. Wallets, cash, Megan's car keys, beach bags, and towels. The girls were in bikinis, so the police ruled out robbery or violence against them as motives. Megan had a towel draped over her head soaked in her blood. Cherish lay on Megan with a head wound as well. As later determined by the medical examiner, each girl had been shot twice in the head from close range with a .38 caliber firearm. There was a lot of blood around the bodies. Besides the bullet holes, there were no other injuries on the victims, as if they had been caught off guard and didn't fight for their lives. Therefore, reluctantly, the police had to consider whether this was someone the girls knew. It seemed unlikely that a stranger could have approached so closely without the victims screaming or attempting to escape. And who could have known they would be relaxing in this isolated part of the beach? It appeared that the attack was planned, and someone had been monitoring them and traveled all the way from home. But who would want to kill 2 schoolgirls? The police began interviewing possible witnesses among local residents and regular beachgoers because although it was a remote part of the beach, families were nearby and cars were parked in the lot. They should have heard gunshots or the victims' cries. One regular beachgoer indeed heard sounds around 12:30 that he mistook for fireworks. Now, of course, it was evident he had heard 4 gunshots. Shortly afterward, a car passed by him that he hadn't seen there before. It was a long blue car resembling a Chevrolet Nova or something similar. Officers also went to the parking lot where Megan's car was parked and noticed something strange. There were plenty of open parking spots, but someone had blocked Megan's car in such a way that she couldn't leave. It wasn't a Chevrolet, but the car turned out to be blue. Approaching, the officers saw a man inside with a camera on his lap. When asked what he was doing there, the man explained that he had been photographing birds in the area all day. He had seen people, of course, but not teenage girls dancing on the beach. He rather aggressively stated that he had no interest in watching girls dance on the beach. Curiously, who mentioned anything about dancing on the beach? The man was taken in for questioning and a weapon was found in his trunk. The police were already rubbing their hands, thinking they had quickly solved the case. During questioning, the man admitted he had seen the girls but denied any involvement in the murders, claiming they were alive when he passed by them on the beach. He even underwent a polygraph test. The gun found in his trunk turned out to be a completely different caliber than the murder weapon, so the suspect was released. The bartender from the establishment near the beach where the girls died recalled a strange incident that occurred on the day of the murders involving an unusual visitor. He entered as soon as the establishment opened, ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail, but the bartender wasn't quite ready for service due to a delay, so she told the man the drink would be on the house. However, he insisted on paying. This alone wouldn't have been odd, except for his words. "You'd better take this money because it's the first and last time I'll come in here." Whether he meant to offend her or not, he stayed in the bar for 40 minutes and left shortly before the presumed time of Megan and Cherish's murders. Meanwhile, it was getting dark, approaching dinner time, when Megan and Cherish were expected home, but they hadn't returned. Megan's mother called Cherish's parents to see if her daughter was with them, but they hadn't seen her either. The woman was a bit worried, but she knew the girls were responsible and assumed they were just running a bit late. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The Florida police notified their colleagues in Thomasville about what had happened and asked them to inform the families of the victims. How can anyone prepare someone for the news that their loved one will never come home again? It was a tragedy for both families. They felt as though they had lost two daughters. Although the officers tried to be as tactful as possible, they needed to ask several questions. The girls' relatives explained that they spent almost all their time together, either at Megan's house or Cherish's. The only other person they spent a lot of time with was Alex, Cherish's boyfriend. The families insisted that Alex had nothing to do with the murders, but everyone was considered a suspect until ruled out by the police. Moreover, they were troubled by how the killer got so close to the girls. This meant they didn't see him as a threat. Therefore, suspicion fell on Alex next. But he seemed genuinely grieving, just like everyone else, unable to believe they were gone. The police were convinced that Alex must have known where the girls would be hanging out. He replied that he could have found out if he wanted to, but they never discussed it. Additionally, when Megan and Cherish went to the beach, he was at work in the factory. His colleagues indeed confirmed the young man's alibi, so the police left Alex alone and allowed him to mourn the loss of his girlfriend and her friend. The police had no solid leads and disclosed almost nothing to the public. Therefore, all sorts of wild rumors circulated about the motive for the murders. Some speculated that the girls were random victims of drug smuggling, with smugglers landing on the beach and killing unwanted witnesses. However, there was no evidence of any boat landing on the beach. Others recalled that the beach used to be a nudist beach and suggested the girls might have been targeted for occasionally sunbathing topless there. But Megan and Cherish were in bikinis, so this theory didn't make sense. The most plausible theory was that someone was upset about Cherish's father's tobacco business, perhaps due to a failed deal, and took out their anger on his daughter. However, the police couldn't find any evidence to support this theory. Time passed, and the police couldn't make progress. There was neither a motive nor evidence to find the culprit. Even experienced police officers didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, societal pressure was mounting. The only lead that demanded substantial police resources was the blue Chevrolet Nova. Police spoke with all owners of similar blue cars in the state of Florida. In Georgia, they couldn't do this because in 1992, the state lacked a database of car colors. Officers went door to door, interviewing car owners. Several times they felt they were onto something, such as when they discovered that an owner of a similar model lived across the street from one of the girls, or when they found a former convict acting suspiciously at the crime scene. But all these promising leads didn't amount to anything. Suddenly, a woman called the sheriff's office in Tallahassee. She claimed to know who shot the girls because she was on the beach when it happened. This call was a godsend for the police, giving them renewed hope that the case would be solved. She said the man's name was Sam Haynes, and he lived near the beach. However, When asked to identify herself, she hung up. She had called from a payphone, so tracing her location was impossible. Although the police desperately wanted to find her, as she confessed to being involved in the crime, they couldn't locate her. It turned out that despite Sam living near the beach, he was actually working at a construction site in Atlanta, Georgia, 6 hours away from the crime scene. Investigators suspected Sam might have followed the girls when they drove that day. Upon learning he was being sought, Sam contacted the police himself. He claimed he was at work in Atlanta on March 27th and insisted someone was lying about him. Sam suspected it was Linda, his ex-wife's sister. As it turned out, Sam was not mistaken. Linda accused her former brother-in-law of the high-profile murder of the two girls as revenge for mistreatment of her sister. It's remarkable she took this step, considering she could have been arrested herself. In any case, detectives spent a lot of time in vain. If it weren't for the next crucial event, they wouldn't have solved the case no matter how hard they worked. On Friday, May 15th at 10 a.m., the sheriff's office received another call. It was a resident of Tallahassee claiming to know who killed Megan and Cherish. The killer was her ex-boyfriend, Robert Neil Rodriguez. This sounded familiar to the investigators, who had lost hope of it being anything other than another scorned ex. So they asked her why she thought he had killed someone. But the woman said he confessed himself. Robert had called her the previous evening and told her everything, convincing her he was serious. He begged her to wait until the next morning to call the police. She kept her promise. One detective thought the man's name sounded vaguely familiar and reviewed the list of people involved in the case. Robert's name was indeed on it because he owned a blue car, though not a Chevrolet Nova, but a 1979 Plymouth Volare, a model very similar to the Chevrolet. The caller couldn't provide any more information, particularly about Robert's current location, but she knew he planned to leave town and was armed. She added that he had previously lived with his mother in Tallahassee, about an hour's drive from Alligator Point Beach. Robert's neighbors confirmed he had moved out of the apartment on May 2nd or 3rd. During the search of his apartment, books on death and other items suggesting a specific, possibly depressed state of mind were found, but no weapon. The police stations around the country were informed of the new suspect's description. Meanwhile, the investigators tried to recall what Robert had told them that caused them to strike his name from the suspect list. But as they began to delve into his past, they were horrified to realize that he was a former police officer from Portland, Oregon. He served in the police force for 2 years, from 1975 to 1977. The officers were shocked because the murderer who committed such a terrible crime could have been one of them. When they approached him about his blue car, he immediately claimed to be a former police officer himself and offered to undergo a polygraph test. But the police stated that it was just a routine check and left him alone. As it turned out, they were wrong. Incredibly, just 8 hours after the woman's call at 6 p.m., the police phone rang again. This time, it was a man introducing himself as Robert Neil Rodriguez. Being a former police officer, he immediately provided his driver's license number to prove it was really him. Then Robert convinced the officer that he was the one who committed the murder. He simply confessed. Robert provided the police with information known only to the killer. For example, the fact that Megan had a towel on her face. He even said he was calling from a payphone on the road in New Mexico, heading to the Grand Canyon National Park, driving his Plymouth. Robert's voice sounded so detached and subdued that detectives feared he might do something foolish. Detectives asked him to surrender to help him, but Robert said it was too late for him and he wouldn't go to prison. He feared that as a former police officer, he would have a hard time in prison. Detectives hurried to find the man, but were also afraid to show his photo in the news. They feared that if Robert's photo appeared in the news, he might do something irreversible, or someone else might take matters into their own hands. The next morning, on May 16th in New Mexico along the route to the Grand Canyon National Park, a blue Plymouth was found on the highway. The license plates on the car were from Utah, but when they checked them, it turned out they had been stolen on May 8th from a parking lot in Utah. The car was just parked on the highway. Inside sat a man who matched the description of Robert Rodriguez. He looked as though he had lost consciousness. A vial with a white substance dangled from a leather lace around his neck, and a handwritten note lay on the dashboard. The note was addressed to anyone who found the man. In it, Robert, confirming it was indeed him, wrote that he had taken cyanide and under no circumstances should anyone try to revive him with artificial respiration, as the rescuer might get poisoned themselves. On the passenger seat was a notebook where Robert explained in more detail that he had consumed cyanide mixed with scotch for the parents of Megan and Cherish and to avoid imprisonment. There was a gun in the car, but it was a .22 caliber, not the one used to fire the deadly bullets. However, the most intriguing part was that according to Robert's final promise, the Florida police should expect a letter from him detailing how and why he killed the girls. When the parents of the girls heard the news, they were shocked and puzzled. Megan's father wondered, could they have hired a former police officer as a hitman? He couldn't fathom the idea that a stranger could shoot his daughter just like that. He believed it must have been a professional killer. Meanwhile, Cherish's mother, upon learning about the discoveries during the search of Robert Rodriguez's home, wondered if he was a serial killer who hated women. If he was so obsessed with killings, shouldn't he have killed more than 2 people by his age? Of course, at that time, she didn't know how close to the truth she was. And then, on May 18th, the first letter from Robert surfaced. It didn't go to the police, but to a newspaper. In it, he disclosed where the police should look for his body because initially Robert had intended to reach the canyon. He also claimed that he would be sought in connection with 3 committed murders. Incredibly, he admitted that the police themselves wouldn't have been able to link him to 3 murders, but he simply couldn't stay silent. In 1984, he killed another innocent girl, Valerie Hunt. That his 3rd victim was Valerie Hunt. He killed her in 1984, and the police will receive all the details about the murders by mail. Valerie was a 22-year-old student from Tallahassee. Her body was found in September of that same year near the pond. The police initially treated the case as a disappearance, possibly suspecting she had run away, but everyone who knew her didn't believe she would willingly disappear. Her boyfriend reported her disappearance when her boss called to say she hadn't shown up for work, although she was always reliable. Like Megan and Cherish, Valerie went to the pond to swim and sunbathe. She frequented the area often, was a strong swimmer, and it was incredible that she drowned. The cause of her death was undetermined because her body was heavily decomposed. Now, finally, it became clear that she was Robert Rodriguez's first victim. On the 19th, finally, a letter arrived at the police, after which Robert's messages were received by the families of all his victims, his friends, and former girlfriends with whom he had good relationships. The police didn't disclose the details of the message until they had verified every word from the man. They asked the families of the girls to do the same, but Megan's father decided differently. He saw both letters, Megan and Cherish's families, and said they were practically identical, with no hint of an apology in either. Robert revealed the details of how he committed the crime, although Megan's father would have preferred him not to. On March 27th, around noon, Robert entered a cafe near Alligator Point Beach. It was he who ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail and insisted on paying for it. The bartender confirmed this when she saw his picture. He left the establishment around 1 p.m. and headed to the beach. Witnesses who found the bodies passed Megan and Cherish at 1:45, and they were already dead. That is, after leaving the bar, he immediately went to the beach where he saw the girls and killed them. He was haunted by a fantasy in which he raped, beat, and killed a girl. These thoughts had plagued him for a long time, and he couldn't find an explanation or justification for this obsession. And though he dreamed of violence, he assured the police and the girls' families that he hadn't done anything like that to Valerie, Megan, or Cherish. After killing Valerie, he told himself he could live a normal life and that if he did it again, he would kill himself. And then, when he came across Megan and Cherish, he couldn't hold back. They did nothing to provoke him. He had never met them before, but chose them because they were young, attractive, and vacationing in a remote area. It was all over in seconds. He shot Megan first. Cherish began to scream and back away. Then he shot her. Megan had a towel in her hand and it fell over her head when he shot. Then he shot each one more time to make sure they were dead before fleeing. All the letters were written matter-of-factly, and there was practically no emotion in them. It must have been very difficult to read them. Megan's mom again raised the question that worried everyone. How could he harbor this passion for murder for 8 long years before killing again? Megan's father speculated that Robert became engrossed in religion, then lost faith again, and therefore killed again. But investigators noticed another interesting pattern. He divorced shortly before Valerie's murder in 1984. And he had just broken up with his girlfriend before Megan and Cherish's murders. One of his church friends said he sometimes got angry about relationships. Maybe that's how he vented his anger. and his mother died on Easter morning in 1992, and since he no longer had any truly close people, he decided to confess everything. The pastor of his church said Robert was struggling internally. His loving and caring nature fought against the evil inside him. He stuttered about suicide at least twice, and he was taking medication previously used to treat depression, but its effect was linked to aggressive behavior and thoughts of harming himself. When people gathered for service on Sunday, May 17th, and didn't see Robert, they couldn't believe what they had learned about him. They called him Bob, sincerely loved him, helped others, and he wasn't the person they read about in the news. One woman said it was so much like him, warning that he had taken cyanide. Another admitted she wouldn't be able to read news about criminals and judge them as before because she knew one personally. She will think about the people who loved this man, because they exist, and she is one of them. It's clear that Robert didn't understand the reason behind his obsession and didn't want to harm innocent strangers. It's unfortunate that he couldn't overcome his inner demons and stop himself before taking the lives of 3 innocent individuals, Valerie Hunt, Megan Carr, and Cherish DeSantis, and breaking the hearts of both their loved ones and his own. Los Angeles, California. Every day of every year, young people from all over the country come here, hoping to make their dreams come true. Some want to become movie stars, others dream of singing on stage or working in the fashion industry, but not everyone shares these hopes and dreams. Among the stars, the glitz, and the glamour, there are those who come to Hollywood to escape their past, an unworthy past. In a city where strangers never attract attention, they can easily blend into the crowd. In 2001, the dreams of one girl would be cut short after a night of bloody crime. Her connection with a famous Hollywood actor would turn her death into a sensation. But this story holds much more. Decades of cat-and-mouse games between the police and a calculating killer. A man whose knife pierced not 1, but 4 young women. A serial killer who would become known as the Hollywood Ripper or the Boy Next Door. It happened almost 30 years ago in Glenview, Illinois. But even today, the Picachio family is haunted by memories of the day they learned that Trisha had been brutally murdered. 18-year-old Trisha Picachio had just graduated from high school. On an unusually cool and foggy Friday evening, August 13, 1993, Trisha and her school friends gathered to play a scavenger hunt. Then they all had dinner at a restaurant. Essentially, it was their last meeting before the young people started their university education. After a pleasant evening, the girl returned home a little after 1 in the morning. Holding her keys in her hand, she approached the door, intending to open it, but she never managed to do so. The next morning, her father woke up as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to his van. The cup fell from his hand when his eyes were confronted with a scene too horrific to describe in words. He fell to his knees before his daughter and screamed. His scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, alarming all the neighbors. Despite the apparent futility of his efforts, Trisha's father tried to provide first aid to bring her back to life. When Trisha's mother learned what had happened, she fainted. Later, both parents were taken to the hospital in a state of shock. The police immediately began an investigation. Trisha had obviously been attacked, her arm twisted so severely that it broke, and she had received multiple stab wounds. But who could have wished such a death upon an 18-year-old girl loved by many? The investigators did their utmost, but a year after the murder, they had made no progress. However, about 12 months after Trisha's death, a neighbor's boy began attracting attention with his strange behavior. 17-year-old Michael Gargiulo was the best friend of Trisha's brother, Doug Picachio. Right after the incident, his reaction was quite natural. The boy was in shock over the murder of the neighbor girl he personally knew. He practically grew up in the Picachio house, often having dinner with the family. And just 2 days before her murder, Michael and another friend, Olson, had given Trisha a ride to her boyfriend's house. Overall, Michael was just a quiet guy to the Picachio family, a friend of their son who had never shown any oddities. But a year after Trisha's murder, the teenager started giving gifts to the family. It started with flowers he brought to Trisha's mother. Then he gave her and her husband a gift certificate for a restaurant dinner. And later, he bought Trisha's father a shirt. This was enough for detectives Jack Reed and Mark Baldwin from Cook County, Illinois, to take a closer look at the boy. A psychologist suggested that with these gifts, he was trying to atone for some sin. The detectives learned that Gargiulo had previously been involved in theft. Then Trisha's brother told the police about an interesting conversation he had with Michael. Michael once asked him if he knew who attacked Trisha. Would he be able to kill him? Doug said that the answer was known to any father or brother of a murdered girl. After this conversation, a detective called Doug and said that according to Michael, Doug had threatened him. It seemed that Michael at least knew more than he was saying, and when he was invited for a conversation at the station, he admitted that the morning after the murder, their mutual friend Eric Agazim had come to him and asked for help hiding something in his gym bag. Michael insisted he didn't know what was in the bag, but suspected it was the murder weapon, a knife. The detectives believed Michael, and when Agazim refused to talk to the police, he immediately became their main suspect. However, the investigators could not find any evidence against Eric, and the investigation stalled. For several years, there were no developments in the case. But one day, 5 years after Trisha's murder, Michael Gargiulo appeared on the Picachio family's doorstep. Clearly, he was still tormented by what he knew about the case, and he asked Trisha's mother if he could speak with her husband. The man wasn't home, so she let the boy wait for him. When Trisha's father entered the house, he immediately understood from Michael's face that they were in for a serious conversation. But before they could exchange even a few words, the door opened and Michael's father and one of his sisters came in. Without providing any explanation, they just took the boy away with them. Trisha's father immediately contacted the police and said they should talk to Michael again, but they were too late. Michael Gargiulo had left Glenview. Hollywood, 2001. 8 years and thousands of miles from the murder of Trisha Picachio. The bright lights of Hollywood have always attracted the young and beautiful. 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was no exception. For a girl from a small town in Northern California, life in Los Angeles was full of opportunities, new acquaintances, and entertainment. Ashley studied at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Naturally, she dreamed of working in the fashion industry. In the meantime, she loved having fun with her close-knit group of friends who always spent time together. One evening, the beautiful and smiling girl caught the eye of a rising Hollywood star, 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. The young people had crossed paths at parties thrown by mutual friends, so when Ashton invited Ashley out to dinner, no one was surprised. They spoke on the phone and agreed that he would pick her up and they would go to a restaurant together. Ashton arrived at about 10:45 p.m. The lights were on in all the rooms, and the young man confidently knocked on the door, but the girl did not open it. He knocked again, but again there was no response. Ashton thought he was too late. Ashley got upset and left with friends. However, before leaving, he peeked through the window by the door. The apartment was a bit messy, but Ashley had just moved in, and that was quite natural. He also saw red wine spilled on the carpet. Not giving it much thought, Ashton went home. As we know now, it was not wine at all. The body of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered by her neighbor early Thursday morning. The girl entered the house and almost immediately saw her friend lying on the floor, blue and covered in blood. Fearing that the killer might still be in the house, she ran outside and called emergency services. But she was in vain to hurry. The killer had long since disappeared, and it was too late to help Ashley. Detectives who arrived at the crime scene, Tom Small, were confronted with a gruesome sight. Even after so many years, they clearly remember seeing an enormous amount of blood, with Ashley lying a little further away. They marveled at the rage the killer must have been in to stab her 47 times. But what astonished the detectives even more was what they didn't see, any clues that would tell them which direction to move. Ashley's friends provided the detectives with one and only one hint in this case, telling them about a young man who had lived next door to Ashley a few months ago. He introduced himself to her as Michael, a heating and air conditioning repairman. When Ashley's friend's heater broke, they invited Michael over. When he appeared at their house, the young man mentioned that he was a professional boxer, but when he first arrived in Hollywood in 1998, like many other young people, he nurtured another dream, to make it big on the screen. Quite quickly, he achieved a certain level of success in this field, landing a small role as a boxer in 1999. He handled it excellently, but something strange happened behind the camera. He behaved distantly, maybe even a bit shy, and didn't talk to anyone, keeping to himself. He seemed to have two sides to his personality. On one side, he was a clumsy guy with a lot of insecurities, but upon closer acquaintance, it became clear, if he wanted something, he would achieve it at any cost, shutting off all emotions. Michael had even once been arrested for theft, and it was this manner of behavior that puzzled Ashley and her friends. Ashley was a beauty, always open to communication, but Michael never invited her on a date or flirted with her. It seemed as if he was interested not in her, but in the lifestyle she led. Hanging out with actors like Vin Diesel and Jeremy Sisto, he became fixated on her. This wasn't particularly strange in itself, but one time, Ashley's friend Justin caught Michael sitting in his car at night across from her house, watching her apartment. The next day, when Michael dropped by, Justin directly asked him what it all meant. Michael's response shocked him. He allegedly couldn't go home because FBI agents from Chicago were waiting there to take DNA samples from him in connection with the murder of his best friend's girlfriend. Naturally, Justin suggested that Michael give a DNA sample if he had nothing to hide. Unexpectedly, Michael put his foot on the couch and showed a knife in a sheath, hinting that he was involved in the murder. Justin got angry and kicked the guy out of the house. Ashley and her friends brushed off Michael's story as another one of his tall tales. But what no one knew at the time was that it was true. Besides being an aspiring actor, amateur boxer, and heating repairman, Michael Gargiulo was also the prime suspect in the murder of Trisha Picachio. When Michael Gargiulo left Chicago, Illinois, he surely thought he was leaving the murder of Trisha far behind. But wherever he went, a new body would appear. In 2005, 12 years after Trisha's murder and 4 years after Ashley's death, Gargiulo was living in the Los Angeles suburb of El Monte. By this time, the cases of both Ashley and Trisha had been largely forgotten. But by a sinister twist of fate, yet another young woman was found dead in her apartment just steps away from Gargiulo's new residence. 32-year-old Maria Bruno had come to the United States from El Salvador and married young. Maria and her husband were raising 2 children aged 4 and 5, and one set of twins when they made the difficult decision to separate. The children stayed with their father while Maria adjusted to her new life. One fateful day, an unknown assailant removed the protective screen from the kitchen window of her ground-floor apartment, grabbed a knife right there on the spot, and entered the bedroom where she was peacefully sleeping. A woman of delicate build, defenseless, she lay asleep in the bedroom of her apartment, the very place where she should have felt completely safe. This attack was a nightmare for any woman, but it also became a nightmare for any detective because the perpetrator left behind a horrific scene. The ferocity with which the unknown attacker assaulted Maria was phenomenal. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery and a sexual motive. As with Ashley, Maria had no enemies capable of such an act. But this time, the assailant left something behind. Near the apartment, forensic experts found a booty with a drop of Maria's blood and an unknown person's DNA on it. This was both a clue and a dead end. No other evidence was found. Detectives, Mark Littlefield, immediately realized that investigating this case would be challenging. What they couldn't know at that moment was that another woman would have to face the killer to solve this crime. On April 28th at 12:30 a.m., a call came into the police reporting a stabbing. The victim was 26-year-old Michelle Murphy. On that day, she was alone in her apartment because her roommate was away. The story of what she went through sounds eerily familiar, but this woman was not ready to give up without a fight. At around 11:40 p.m., an intruder entered her apartment through a slightly open window. Once inside, he opened the front door, preparing an escape route. He then calmly walked to the bedroom. The man simply began stabbing Michelle, managing to strike her several times in the chest, shoulder, and right arm. Michelle woke up to the blows being inflicted by the intruder looming over her. For a moment, she didn't know whether it was a dream or if it was really happening. Realizing that she was in mortal danger, she tried to wrest the knife from him. She continued to attempt to grab the weapon, even as her hands bled from deep wounds. For a while, Michelle and the intruder struggled until she managed to pull her legs up to her chest and push him away. Understanding that he couldn't overpower Michelle, the intruder fled, not forgetting to say, "I'm sorry," before leaving. The perpetrator managed to escape before the police arrived, but during the struggle with Michelle, he cut himself with his own knife, leaving a long trail of blood as he fled. About 25 days after the detective sent the blood sample to the lab, forensic experts reported a DNA match. The DNA matched Michael Gargiulo perfectly. Within 24 hours, Gargiulo was arrested and charged with attempted murder. What stunned the detectives was where he lived, right across the street from Michelle. But Gargiulo's arrest for the attack on Michelle was only the beginning. The investigation would finally connect a series of unsolved murders that had begun 15 years earlier. It was evident that Michael Gargiulo wasn't particularly surprised when he was arrested by Sergeant Richard Lewis for the attempted murder of Michelle on the evening of June 6, 2008, as he specifically asked which department the officers represented. The fact that he wasn't sure which crime he was being arrested for was intriguing in itself. His question had a basis, as Michael Gargiulo's DNA had been found in the national database. It was entered there by the Cook County Police in Illinois. The Santa Monica detectives contacted Illinois investigators to find out why they had done so and learned that Gargiulo was suspected of murder. The Santa Monica investigators discovered that in 2002, Cook County Police, who had continued to investigate the Trisha Picachio case, asked the Los Angeles police for help in obtaining Michael's DNA. By an amazing coincidence, they approached Detective Tom Small, who was investigating Gargiulo's involvement in the murder of Ashley Ellerin. It took the detective over a year to locate the elusive air conditioning repairman, linking him to Trisha's case. And 5 years later, that very DNA sample would help connect Gargiulo to the attack in Santa Monica. But that was far from the end of the story. The Santa Monica investigators called the El Monte police, suspecting that the attack on Michelle might be related to the murder of Maria Bruno. The El Monte detectives returned to Gargiulo's old apartment to search it and found the missing shoe cover. The unknown DNA found on one shoe cover also matched Gargiulo. With the necessary evidence in hand, the detectives had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The Los Angeles prosecutor decided that there was enough evidence to start a case against Michael Gargiulo. On September 4, 2008, while Mike was in jail for the attack in Santa Monica, he was charged with the additional murders of Ashley and Maria. However, the California investigators could not find an answer to one question. Why didn't the Cook County Police in Illinois arrest him years ago for Trisha's murder, thus preventing the deaths of 2 more girls? After all, in 2003, the police had linked the DNA sample obtained by Los Angeles detectives to the unknown DNA found under Trisha's nails. These were the pieces of evidence that could have helped arrest him. Even Trisha's family was confident that this was solid evidence, but the prosecutor decided not to open the case, arguing that the DNA alone was not enough to prove that Gargiulo was at the crime scene when Trisha was attacked. The DNA could have been left not only during the struggle for her life, but also after a casual touch. Mike was a family friend and often visited the house, which was the main obstacle in accusing Mike of Trisha's murder. The prosecutor's office explained that since the lab used one swab to collect DNA from Trisha's nails, it was impossible to determine whether the DNA was on the nails or under them. The difference in this case was enormous. A simple but evidently imperfect laboratory procedure tied the prosecutor's hands. Michael wasn't charged with Trisha's murder until 2011, when a man who worked as a bouncer at a Los Angeles nightclub with Gargiulo recalled seeing him in the news and remembered that Gargiulo had boasted to him and another club employee about killing a girl in Chicago. Gargiulo did not mince words, describing how he committed the crime and allowed her father to find her on the doorstep. After receiving the men's testimonies, the Illinois prosecutor charged Michael Gargiulo with Trisha's murder. This was the news the Picachio family had been waiting to hear for 18 years. It didn't ease their pain, but the thought that the guilty party would be punished brought some relief. Gargiulo, evidently doubting that he would be found innocent, planned to escape from El Monte jail. He made makeshift handcuffs out of plastic and intended to attack a guard, steal a police car, and flee to Mexico. However, his plan failed, and he spent several years in Los Angeles jail awaiting trial. After several delays, the trial began on May 2, 2019. It lasted 3.5 months, with over 200 people testifying. Among them was Ashton Kutcher, who recounted the night 18 years ago when he arrived at Ashley Ellerin's door moments after she had been killed. Kutcher testified clearly and directly. He had met Ashley 2 months earlier at a friend's party. At that time, he was in a relationship, but by the time Ashley invited him to her housewarming party 2 weeks later, he had broken up with his girlfriend. Ashley was also single, so Ashton asked her out to dinner. He arrived at her place quite late because he had been watching the Grammy Awards with friends. When Ashley didn't open the door, he simply went home. Upon learning that she had been murdered, Ashton immediately called the police and informed them that his fingerprints were on her door. Michelle Murphy also testified. She recalled the night of the attack and then spoke about the immense happiness she felt when she became a mother after everything that had happened. However, all she could think about were the parents of Trisha, Ashley, and Maria, whose daughters had been so heartlessly taken from them by this monster. After giving her testimony, she went downstairs to her husband, hugged him, and cried. Gargiulo's lawyer built his defense on the claim that his client was mentally ill and did not understand what he was doing. However, the prosecution proved that Gargiulo had stalked his victims for a long time, waited for the right moment to attack, and planned each assault meticulously, knowing how to avoid punishment. This indicated that he knew exactly what he was doing. Additionally, a former friend of Michael's testified that Gargiulo frequently searched the internet for information on forensics and how to evade punishment for crimes. The prosecutor argued that there was indeed an intimate component to his attacks, even though he did not sexually assault the women. It was the killings themselves that brought him pleasure. On August 15, 2019, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On July 16, 2021, he was sentenced to the highest penalty. He will be extradited to Illinois, where he will face trial for the murder of Trisha Picachio. In Illinois, the punishment for first-degree murder ranges from 25 years to life imprisonment. The psychologist who was asked to analyze Gargiulo's attacks stated that the similarities between the crimes allowed for identifying the characteristic features of his murders. First and foremost, there was the audacity of the attacks. He did not strike in the dead of night but chose times when neighbors or passers-by could see him. Additionally, attacking with a knife involved very close contact, allowing him to look his victims in the eyes. What he did to the young women allowed him to strip them of their identity and humiliate their human dignity. The psychologist suggests that since they were neighbors and he could frequently observe the beautiful women, he put them on a pedestal. At the same time, he harbored a kind of contempt for them because he desired them, which gave the women power over him. Gargiulo felt the need to rectify this situation. He believed he could regain control only in the most horrifying way, not just by killing them, but by stripping away all their humanity. During one of the interrogations, Michael remarked that just because 10 women were killed and his DNA was found on them, it didn't mean he had killed anyone. This statement, along with testimonies from other witnesses, led the police to suspect that Michael might be responsible for the deaths of 10 people, even though he is officially accused of only 4 attacks. Since Michael Gargiulo traveled between Illinois and California, detectives believe there could be more victims. On a beautiful autumn morning on October 22, 1993, Doug Boggs entered his hardware store in the resort town of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. The store had been in operation for 63 years, a family business that Doug ran with his brother, Gerald or Jerry Bogs. However, that morning, Jerry did not show up for work. This was entirely uncharacteristic of him. Jerry was a creature of habit and adhered to a strict daily routine. Doug became so worried that he went to his brother's home. The front door was locked, so Doug went around to the back door leading into the kitchen. As soon as he opened the door, he saw his brother. Jerry was lying on the floor with blood pooled around his head. It was a horrifying scene that shocked Doug to the core. He immediately called emergency services. The police officers who arrived at the scene based on the man's wounds speculated that he had been beaten with a heavy object and had also sustained 3 gunshot wounds. Now, the investigators had to determine how such a tragedy could happen to one of the most respected and beloved citizens of Steamboat Springs. 52-year-old Jerry Bogs had lived in Steamboat Springs for most of his life. He had only left the town for his studies at the University of Colorado and during his time in the Vietnam War. After returning from Vietnam, he resumed working in the family business, and now he and his brother managed the store together. Jerry handled the paperwork and supply orders while Doug interacted with the customers. Jerry was a fairly strong-willed person, but he was also kind, modest, and a loyal friend. By the age of 52, he had grown accustomed to his established bachelor lifestyle. However, everything changed one fine day when a charming 48-year-old woman walked into his store. She introduced herself as Jill Coe. Jill stood out from the other women in town, even from the tourists. She dressed stylishly and somewhat provocatively, but never vulgarly. She was sociable, cheerful, and spoke with a delightful southern accent. Jill mentioned that she had moved from Culver, Indiana, having bought a small hotel in Steamboat Springs. Since she was fixing up the hotel with her sons, she often appeared in Jerry's store for supplies. Soon, Jerry gathered the courage to make the first move. He asked her out on a date. From that moment on, their romantic relationship began. Just 7 months after meeting, Jerry and Jill got married. This was an unusually spontaneous decision for Jerry, but he had a reason. His beloved was expecting a baby. Jerry had a successful business, family, friends, money, and now his beloved wife was going to give him a child. Jerry was over the moon with happiness. He took the news with full responsibility. He remodeled the house for the baby, bought children's furniture, and read books on parenting. However, his happiness came to an abrupt end as secrets about his wife began to surface one after another. Months went by, yet there were no physical changes in Jill's appearance. By this time, her pregnancy should have been quite visible. Suddenly, Jill went to Texas, and when she returned, she claimed to have given birth to a baby girl named Laura. By then, Jerry's family and friends were not merely suspicious. They outright declared that it was some kind of scam and that he should stay away from her and get a divorce, especially since she forgot to inform him that she was already married at the time they got married. Jerry was devastated, confused as to why she would do this to him, but he knew for certain that the marriage needed to be annulled, as his nature abhorred living in an illegal union. There was also an intriguing financial situation. Jill had convinced Jerry to sign a document stating that he had supposedly lent her $100,000. In reality, he had not given her the money. She needed it to appear as though she owed him a large sum, so she wouldn't have to repay debts to creditors or share finances with her ex-husband. However, after their marriage was annulled and she moved out of his house, Jill sued him. She wanted to remove his name from the document and sell the hotel, which was worth $600,000. As Doug recounted, his brother was already angry about Jill's lies regarding her previous marriage and the fake pregnancy, and the lawsuit brought his indignation and resentment to a new level. Jerry filed a countersuit. He wanted her to stop tarnishing his name, admit there was no pregnancy, and compensate him for his losses. For 2 years, Jerry awaited the court date while he returned to his usual routine. But 6 days before the scheduled court date, his brother found him dead on the kitchen floor. The police carefully examined the crime scene, only to be met with enormous disappointment. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing had been stolen, and the killer had left no clues behind. The murderer took the firearm with them and left no fingerprints or blood on the shovel used to beat the victim. Whoever committed this heinous crime had covered their tracks exceptionally well. Neighbors did not hear any gunshots. However, one neighbor did recall something suspicious. On the day of the murder, she was outside and saw 2 people walking down the street. They looked suspicious enough that she went back inside. Despite the warm weather, they were dressed very warmly and resembled hunters. One was clearly a man, but she wasn't sure about the second person. There was definitely something off about them. At the same time, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy. He determined that the attack on Jerry Bogs had occurred in the afternoon of October 21st. He confirmed that Jerry had been shot 3 times, beaten, and an attempt had been made to strangle him. However, he was puzzled by marks on the right side of Jerry's neck and cheek. These were not the characteristic muzzle imprints of a point-blank gunshot wound. The medical examiner was unable to determine what had caused these mysterious marks. However, for Jerry's family, his murder was no mystery. Doug Boggs told the police that he knew exactly who was responsible. He pleaded with the police to question Jerry's ex-wife, Jill Coe. Doug's suspicions had been aroused 2 years earlier when Jill claimed she was pregnant. His brother was in love and believed everything Jill said. Concerned, Jerry's relatives contacted a friend who was a private detective and asked her to investigate Jill's background. What the detective uncovered was a completely different Jill than the one Jerry knew. With each new detail, the detective was more and more astounded. She even had difficulty determining Jill's birth year because Jill Coe had 4 birth certificates, 3 social security numbers, and at least 15 different identities she had used over the past 25, 30 years. By the time Jill met Jerry, he was potentially husband number 8. Jill Lanita Billiot was born in Louisiana. She had a tumultuous relationship with her brother, which led her to leave home at 15 and move in with her grandparents in Indiana. Local boys were captivated by her southern accent. One such admirer was 18-year-old Larry Eugene Einen. Evidently, the attraction was mutual because at 17, Jill dropped out of school and married him. The marriage dissolved quickly, within a couple of months. And when Jill left her young husband, she took the only thing he had, $280 earned from his masonry assistant job. Interestingly, divorce at that time required stating a reason. Larry cited cruel and inhumane treatment, while Jill requested a restraining order against him. What exactly transpired between the young couple remains unknown, but Jill was determined not to work a modest factory job. She decided to complete her education and returned to Louisiana to attend acting classes at the university. For 3 years, she managed to focus on her studies, at least not marrying anyone. However, she eventually married another student, Stephen Moore. Unfortunately, even the birth of their son, Seth, could not save their marriage. Jill left Stephen and moved to Texas with their son. Despite how her approach to life and marriage would change in the future, she didn't gain much financially from her first 2 marriages. While fully aware of her value and attractiveness, Jill secured a job as a model. A beautiful girl caught the eye of successful engineer William Clark Coit Jr. He was unfazed by her 2 previous marriages and adopted Seth as his own son. Jill claimed that he was the love of her life. Despite her happy marriage to William, Jill didn't divorce her second husband until after the birth of her and William's first child. Their second son was born later. William had more resources than any of her previous husbands, which likely sparked Jill's attraction to substantial wealth, and she eagerly spent it. However, William was often away from home, leading Jill to start having affairs. Upon discovering this, William demanded a divorce. A bitter custody battle ensued. But 3 weeks before the divorce was finalized, tragedy struck. William Coit Jr. was murdered in his own home, shot 3 times in the back with a .22 caliber weapon. Detectives believed he knew his killer since he was shot from behind. Before his death, William had withdrawn a substantial amount of money from his accounts, telling friends he did so to prevent Jill from getting it. Unfortunately, he miscalculated. The money was never found, likely because Jill was the one who discovered William's body when he failed to show up for work. Naturally, the police suspected his 27-year-old widow, Jill. However, she managed to flee to New Orleans and hired a lawyer. On his advice, she admitted herself to a psychiatric hospital. This tactic worked, and the police were unable to question her. Without sufficient evidence to extradite her forcibly, Jill spent a year in the psychiatric facility. After her release, she reclaimed her 3 sons from relatives, secured the money she inherited from William, and moved to California to start anew. In California, Jill tried something new. She met Bruce Johansson, who was over 90 years old. Unable to marry him, she used her charm to persuade him to adopt her. After the man passed away, likely from natural causes, she inherited all his assets, finances, and property. She had no time to mourn because she was preparing for marriage number 4 with Major Donald Brody of the Marine Corps. However, Jill unexpectedly found out that her husband could refuse her access to his funds. Their relationship quickly deteriorated, so she resorted to another way to extract money from him. After a lengthy separation, she delighted him with news of giving birth to a boy named Thaddeus John Brody. The Major didn't believe her. She then showed him a fake birth certificate and asked acquaintances to lend her their child temporarily to show him a son, allegedly theirs. But unable to sustain this, a month later she delivered the Major horrifying news. The child had died and she buried him in the family crypt. Fortunately, it was a lie, and when the crypt was later opened, there was no child inside. Realizing she could no longer gain anything from the Major, Jill divorced him and married a man named Louis A. DeRosa. He was a lawyer she hired after fleeing following the death of her 3rd husband, William. He also assisted her in Bruce Johansson's adoption. Their relationship was tumultuous, with the couple divorcing and reconciling 2-3 times over many years. During one of their separations, Jill managed to marry husband number 6, Eldon Dwayne Metzger, an auction organizer. This marriage was very short and illegal because she divorced Louis DeRosa in Haiti, a divorce not recognized in the USA. Thus, she was still legally married to Louis when she moved to Indiana and met her 7th husband. 2 of her sons attended school in Indiana, where one of the boys' school director was Carl V. Steele. Jill lived with him for 7 years, which were some of the longest and most normal relationships in her life. Carl treated her and the boys well. He loved skiing and often took the family to Steamboat Springs, Colorado. They enjoyed their time there and dreamed of growing old together in that place. During one of their trips, the couple decided to invest in a business by purchasing a small hotel. Jill convinced Carl that she would handle everything herself because he was a teacher, and she felt more capable of managing finances. The plan was for Jill to move to Steamboat Springs, buy the hotel in both their names, renovate it with their sons, and start managing it. Carl would join her when school holidays began. However, Carl encountered a very unpleasant surprise when he arrived in town. Jill simply ousted him. She persuaded him to say goodbye to his money, convinced him to invest in her business, and he was no longer needed. She registered the hotel under her and her elder son Seth's name only. Carl was left without money and in debt. After less than 10 years together, Jill and Carl parted ways. They didn't finalize their divorce before Jill set her sights on husband number 8, Jerry Bogs, the owner of a store in Steamboat Springs. Investigators found too many coincidences between the two murder cases of Jill's ex-husbands, William and Jerry. Both men were killed with the same caliber weapon, which was never recovered. In both cases, there was no forced entry into the home. Jill knew the layout of the rooms in the house, knew when Jerry would return home from work, and it would not have been difficult for her to catch William at home in the evening while he watched TV. But the similarities didn't end there. Jill had a financial motive in both crimes. However, when investigators talked to Jill, it turned out she had alibis. In the same month she annulled her marriage to Jerry, she finally divorced Carl Steely, so she was not married to anyone at the time. Perhaps a new feeling for her. Instead, she was dating a telephone technician named Michael Backus. During her conversation with investigators, Jill stated that she and Michael were camping in Poudre Canyon, 240 kilometers away from the crime scene. To set up a tent in that location, they had to fill out a form and pay a fee. This meant that Jill could prove she was in Poudre Canyon if needed. Therefore, she was too far away by the evening of October 21st to have killed Jerry. Investigators decided they needed to pinpoint the exact time frame when the attack on Jerry occurred. A crucial piece of evidence was studying the contents of his stomach. Jerry Bogs was a creature of habit. He opened his store at the same time every day. Then at 11 a.m., he went to a restaurant for breakfast where he always ate the same meal: hash browns, eggs, and toast. Specialists used plant cells, which, unlike protein-based foods, pass through the digestive system unchanged. They determined that Jerry had consumed onions. However, the restaurant chef did not add onions to the hash browns, eggs, or toast. This indicated that Jerry had indeed eaten his meal, meaning he was killed closer to the evening of October 21st, when Jill had an alibi. Thus, Jill had a motive, but no opportunity to kill him. If Jill didn't kill him, who did? Perhaps the unidentified hunters who had frightened Jerry's neighbor. However, the police had no leads on how to find them. Then, on a hunch, one of the investigators visited the restaurant where Jerry had breakfast and stood in the kitchen, observing the chef at work. He noticed that although the chef didn't add onions to the hash browns, he used the same spatula to mix them as he did with onions. This contamination could explain why onion particles were found in Jerry's system. It indicated that he was killed 3 hours after breakfast, a time frame during which Jill didn't have an alibi. Furthermore, the police couldn't find the form she supposedly filled out for the Poudre Canyon visit. This meant she hadn't been camping with her boyfriend and they had both lied. Interestingly, while the police awaited the results from Jerry's stomach contents, Jill managed to get married again, possibly for the last time. When unpleasant rumors began circulating about her in Steamboat Springs, she left for Las Vegas, where she seduced Roy Carroll, a retired Navy officer. However, before the end of the year, she left him and reunited with Michael Backus. According to some sources, she married him. Although no marriage certificate was found, she used his surname in any case. Meanwhile, gathering only circumstantial evidence, the police managed to obtain a search warrant for the suspect's car. Inside, they found maps of Mexico, a couple of wigs, and a stun gun. The discovery of the stun gun prompted the police to exhume Jerry's body to conduct several tests. It turned out that the marks on the victim's face matched those from this weapon. Additionally, the wigs found in Jill's car matched the description of the appearance of the two hunters observed by Jerry's neighbor on the day of his murder. However, the police were unable to arrest the accomplices because they had disappeared. The case would have stalled if not for unexpected assistance from a surprising source: Jill's eldest son, Seth. He called the police and revealed that his mother had asked him to help cover up Jerry's murder and dispose of the body. However, Seth liked Jerry and refused to assist. He informed the police that when the net started closing in on their associates, Jill and Michael traveled to California, crossed by boat from San Diego to Tijuana, then to Mexico City, and finally to Spain. Without Seth's cooperation, Jill might never have been apprehended. However, just a week later, she decided to return to the United States, where police officers tracked her down. Some speculate that she ran out of money. In any case, returning was an incredible risk, bringing her not only back to the country, but also to Steamboat Springs, where she drove around town in her own car, seemingly unfazed by the danger. On December 23, 1993, Jill and Michael were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Even during questioning, Jill behaved provocatively, attempting to flirt with detectives and vehemently asserting her innocence. She was nearly 50 years old, but had never faced serious legal consequences despite her numerous marriages without proper divorces, document forgery, identity theft, insurance fraud, and being a potential suspect in her third husband's murder. She firmly believed that money ruled the world and that she was untouchable. The trial began in 1995. One by one, witnesses took the stand, including Michael Backus's colleague, who testified that Jill and Michael had tried to persuade them to kill Jerry Bogs, citing false claims that he had harmed a young girl and deserved to die. However, Jerry was a respected member of society, and these claims did not hold up under scrutiny. Furthermore, after her breakup with Jerry, Jill posed as a psychologist, ostensibly helping flood victims. During one session, she asked a client for a gun and offered $1,000 to kill Jerry Bogs. Naturally, the client declined this shocking proposal, especially given the context of seeking professional help for trauma. This incident underscored Jill's audacious approach to manipulating others for her own ends. When their associates failed to find someone willing to commit the murder, Jill and Michael decided to take matters into their own hands. Michael and Jill fabricated a camping trip in the canyon. However, they used this as an opportunity to practice disguising themselves. On the appointed day, they walked the streets disguised as a pair of hunters. Jill wore a mustache, wig, beard, and men's clothing. Investigators believe their accomplices entered through the back door and waited for the victim, lying in wait. After Jerry finished work early and returned home around noon, the killers immobilized him using an electroshock gun. They then beat him with a shovel and attempted to strangle him. When that failed, according to detectives, Jill shot her ex-husband 3 times. Later, she called her son Seth and said, "It's over. It's very messy." As Seth testified in court, he knew she was referring to Jerry's murder. Indeed, his testimony proved crucial in convincing the jurors of the guilt of the accomplices. It took them 5 hours to convict both of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Each received a life sentence plus an additional 48 years for conspiracy, along with $1 million fine. Clearly, the fine was intended to prevent them from profiting from any movie or book deals about their story. But even this didn't stop Jill. She advertised herself as a green card for anyone willing to marry her. When this project failed, in 2002 she claimed she was subjected to violence and abuse in prison, and her rights were violated. She alleged that a guard had assaulted her and broken her finger. Additionally, she claimed she was denied special orthopedic devices for arthritis. She attempted similar claims in 2006, but they were not believed. Despite filing appeals, all were rejected. Some might say living in marriage is like being in prison anyway, but for Jill Coe, this prison became a lifelong reality. Jill was furious with Jerry because he dared to stand in her way and thwarted her plans. Not only did he refuse to let her sell the hotel, but a private detective hired by his family had gathered enough evidence to expose her. Jerry intended to bring her to justice in court, revealing who she truly was and what she had done, so she couldn't deceive anyone else. However, like William, Jerry never got the chance to confront Jill face-to-face in court. Both men were killed just days before the trial was set to begin. The murder of Jill's third husband was never solved. Jerry died trying to stop a predator, paying a high price for the truth. While Jill had no trouble cycling through men in her life, she didn't easily let go of their money. For the money she believed rightfully hers, she fought to the death, literally in their deaths. Lola Chomnes was born on November 4, 1999, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She grew up in the family of Adriana Belmonte and Diego Chomnes, the son of the renowned chef Beatrice Chomnes. In November 2014, when the girl turned 15, her parents decided to gift her a trip to New York for the Christmas holidays. However, before that, they sent their daughter to spend a few days relaxing with her godmother's family in Rocha, Uruguay. On December 27th, Lola arrived in Uruguay, where she was greeted by her godmother, Claudia Fernandez. The girl was clearly in a great mood, which was captured in a photo taken by Claudia. Claudia, her husband Hernan Tuzinkiewicz, and their 2 children were happy about Lola's arrival. They had planned to spend these few days together, sunbathing on Barra de Valiza's beach, swimming in the sea, and relaxing. That same evening, Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson visited a drum festival taking place in the city center. Hernan and the boy didn't leave Lola's side in the crowd, but at some point, the boy moved away from them because he was bored. Nevertheless, after the festival, they all returned home together. The next day, the family went to the beach. Around 3 p.m., Lola asked her godmother for permission to take a walk along the beach. She wanted to walk to the spa resort of Aguas Dulces along a fairly popular trail that allowed her to explore the flora and fauna of the area. Since the route was considered popular and safe for walks, and the locals were known for their friendliness, Claudia had no objections. She told Lola what time they would be waiting for her at home and watched as she calmly walked away from them along the beach. Lola was wearing a bikini and denim shorts. She carried a backpack containing a sarong, a book, her identification, a water bottle, and a towel. She didn't have her phone with her. Obviously, there was poor reception on the beach. The backpack also contained a wallet with 2,000 Uruguayan pesos. Several hours passed, it got dark, and Lola still hadn't returned. Her godmother became worried. The family walked along the route that Lola had planned to take, but she was nowhere to be found. In the evening, Claudia called Lola's parents to explain what had happened. She told Adriana that she had already contacted the police. However, it took another 45 minutes before they arrived at the station and reported the teenager's disappearance. The police began the search for Lola. Since she disappeared during a walk on the beach, it was thoroughly searched both lengthwise and crosswise. Helicopters and search dogs were brought in to assist in the search. Lola's parents immediately arrived in Uruguay to help the police. Almost simultaneously with the start of the investigation, it became known that Adriana and Diego were receiving anonymous calls. The caller did not ask for a ransom or make any demands. They simply stated that Lola was with them and that she was fine. Unfortunately, this turned out to be untrue. 2 days later, on December 30th, her body was found partially covered in sand on the beach. She was in an area with many dunes and dense vegetation. There were shallow knife cuts on her neck and signs of blows on her head. The autopsy revealed that Lola was attacked from behind, then dragged or forced to the location where she was found. The killer pressed her face into the sand for a prolonged period until she suffocated. This was determined by the presence of sand in her lungs. After the news of the crime became known, there was an unprecedented uproar in the press of Argentina and Uruguay. As often happens in such cases, journalists began to put forward theories about what could have happened. The suspicions of the Uruguayan police and the media immediately fell on the family of Lola's godmother, especially on Hernan, and there were several reasons for that. Firstly, they claimed to Adriana and Diego that they had already contacted the police, although they actually delayed before going to the station. Secondly, the media tried to see something sinister in the fact that Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson went to a drum festival together, but at some point, the boys separated from them, leaving the girl with Hernan. A hypothesis related to violence against Lola emerged, but the forensic expert found no evidence to support this. However, there were other reasons to suspect them. Claudia and Hernan immediately hired a lawyer, and not a single family member agreed to take a polygraph test. Lola's parents added fuel to the fire by making a series of bold statements. In particular, Diego stated that he had long ceased to trust Hernan, which provoked further questions. If he didn't trust the man, why did he allow his daughter to go on vacation with them? It is important to note that Claudia and Adriana had been friends for 25 years. Hernan was Claudia's second husband, and Lola's parents had known him for about 5 years. They all originally lived in Argentina, but Hernan and Claudia moved to Uruguay. When Hernan was interrogated, the investigators noted contradictory statements, which led to his arrest on December 31st. Claudia was arrested on suspicion of concealing evidence. Her son was also detained because he was suspected of making those anonymous calls. It is not confirmed with certainty that he was the one who called Adriana and Diego, but it is evident that those calls were a failed attempt at a joke. Nevertheless, the police interrogated all three family members for several days, but there was no evidence against them. The investigators explained that they found some discrepancies in their testimonies, but they were insignificant. Hernan claimed they returned home at 11 o'clock, while his son said it was 12. Besides that, the police had nothing to charge Hernan, Claudia, or her son with. Therefore, on January 2, 2015, they were all released. Apparently, after various public statements, the relationship between the friends suffered. Claudia and her loved ones never spoke to Lola's parents again, nor did they pick up the phone to offer condolences. Adriana believes that their lawyer may have given them such advice. However, she believes that as friends, a simple human gesture would have been to call and express condolences, especially considering their 25 years of friendship. A few days after the discovery of the body, Lola's pink backpack was found. It was also buried in the sand about 200 meters from where Lola's body was found. This immediately raised a lot of questions. How did the police initially not find the body and now the backpack, despite thoroughly searching the entire beach and its surroundings multiple times? Additionally, the authorities in the town had claimed from the beginning that the beach was a very safe area. But it was at least strange because drug dealers operated there, especially in the area where the body was found. Nonetheless, almost all of the girl's belongings remained in the backpack, except for 2,000 pesos that the perpetrator took from her wallet. Furthermore, the towel and documents had blood stains on them. Forensic experts examined these items and found Lola's DNA on them, but it was mixed with male DNA. Since suspicions had not been completely lifted from Hernan, his DNA was compared to the one found. They checked it against the Uruguayan police database, but there were no matches there either. After the discovery of the backpack, one suspect caused a big stir. He was suspected based on witness testimonies regarding his whereabouts on the day of the murder. According to local residents, a man nicknamed El Conejo, the rabbit, was working on a roof near the beach at the time the girl went for a walk. In the middle of the day, the man went for lunch, and his colleagues knew that he didn't have any money with him. However, he returned with food and cash. This immediately raised the question of where he got the food if he didn't buy it. But that's not all. Someone even claimed to have seen him with a pink backpack on the day of Lola's disappearance. One newspaper wrote that he confessed to the murder, and other media outlets picked up the news. However, it turned out to be untrue. The man provided an explanation of where he got the food. Although the police suspected that he had actually stolen it from beachgoers, there was no evidence connecting him to Lola's case. He never confessed to anything, and after his release, he filed a lawsuit against the newspapers that spread unverified news. At this point, the investigation significantly stalled. The main suspects had already been released, and the investigators had no leads to pursue. At first glance, it seemed that the girl didn't know anyone in the town, but she had managed to attend a drum festival in the city center, and being sociable and open, she freely interacted with people. Therefore, the police had to investigate this lead. They detained and interrogated about 40 people, mainly vendors and dealers from the beach, but they were all eventually released. The situation was further aggravated by the constant changes in prosecutors and judges, and whenever a new prosecutor was appointed, they would review the case from scratch. This significantly hindered the investigation. But on February 18, 2015, there seemed to be some progress in the case. An anonymous call was made to the police. The caller stated that Angel Moreira, also known as El Cachila or Keisha, was involved in the crime. The police arrested and interrogated the man. He worked on the beach, parking cars. Angel explained that he met Lola when she was walking along the beach. He approached her to offer some souvenir trinkets for sale. They exchanged a few sentences about where the girl came from when Lola mentioned feeling dizzy. Angel suggested that they go to a shady area. He took her to a place where tall bushes and dunes provided some shade and coolness. There, the girl fell to her knees. Angel tried to check her pulse, but not hearing it, he got scared and ran away. The statement sounded extremely strange, but without evidence, the police had to release him. 4 years passed when the new prosecutor in Jorge Bay's case reviewed the materials and decided to interrogate Angel again. After the interrogation on May 22, 2019, the man was arrested. This time he was charged with obstruction of justice. His DNA did not match the DNA on Lola's towel and documents, so the prosecutor concluded that he was covering up the person who was truly guilty of the crime. Bass explained that in Angel's statements made in 2015, he revealed details that only someone who was with Lola at the time of the murder could have known. He knew that Lola fell to her knees on the sand, and a forensic expert confirmed this. However, Lola didn't fall because she suddenly felt dizzy, but because she had received shallow knife wounds. Despite Angel's arrest, the Chomnes family still awaited an answer to the main question for several more years. Until geneticist Natalia Sandberg became interested in the case, 7 years after the murder, the case took a decisive turn. And how the investigators found the suspect resembles a plot from a detective novel. It occurred to Natalia Sandberg to trace the genetic DNA trace of an unknown man found on Lola's towel and documents. There were no matches on the paternal line, but the examination of the maternal line revealed a small match with a prisoner serving time for murder. In other words, the man who left his blood on Lola's towel is related to the man currently serving a sentence. The third crime, in which the victims were Marines who died in the naval complex on Cerro de Montevideo, was the tip of the iceberg that allowed investigators to reach the true killer of Lola Chomnes. The murders took place on Sunday morning, May 31, 2020. Juan Manuel Escobar, Alex Galinia, and Alan Rodriguez were found shot in the head. The police established that the killer is Jonathan Brand Gundy. Jonathan was born in Rocha. When the police found his mother and examined her DNA, it became clear that they were looking for another son of the woman, Jonathan's half-brother. The woman told the investigators that she had given birth to 11 children from different fathers, including 8 boys. But only one son was given up for adoption when he was 18 days old. It turned out that he was the one the police had been searching for 7 years. Their new suspect was named Leonardo Senar. In 2014, during Lola's murder, Senar was homeless, spending his days and nights between La Paloma, Chuy, and Castillos. He lived in these places through odd jobs. But recently, he settled in the city of Chuy, lived with a girlfriend, and worked in a bakery. The man had a history of police records from 2003 to 2009 for aggression, theft, and violence. Despite his run-ins with the law, his DNA was not stored in the database because the database itself was created after 2012. Therefore, on May 18, 2022, the police obtained a search warrant for his house. They anticipated that the man would refuse to provide his DNA, and they were right. However, forensic experts examined the man's toothbrush and comb. To the surprise and joy of the forensic experts, the DNA match was 99.9%, confirming it was his DNA. On May 19th, the suspect was arrested at the border with Brazil. During the interrogation, Leonardo claimed that he had no connection to the crime. As for his DNA found on the identification card and the girl's towel, he explained that he found a pink backpack on the beach. When he looked inside, he saw a wallet with 2,000 pesos and stole the money. Regarding the blood, he said that a few hours before, he cut himself with a bottle shard at work, and when he reached into the backpack, the bandage fell off and the cut started bleeding. Therefore, he wiped his hand with Lola's towel. However, there were several inconsistencies in his version. Firstly, his blood was not simply found on the girl's belongings. it was mixed with her blood. This couldn't have happened if he found the backpack and just took out the wallet. Secondly, according to his own words, someone else, not Leonardo, took Lola's backpack on the 28th, the day of the murder, after Leonardo stole the money and inexplicably buried it 4 kilometers away from where it was found, without taking anything from it. Even the suspect couldn't deny the absurdity of this story. Finally, his colleagues who worked with him in December 2014 didn't recall the incident with a broken bottle and Leonardo's cut. Moreover, according to documentation, Leonardo was no longer employed at the brewery on the day of the crime. Here is what the police believe actually happened. In the middle of the day on December 28, 2014, when Lola went for a walk on the beach, she was intercepted by Leonardo and Angel. They dragged her into an area with dunes and bushes. There, Lola tried to escape, and the kidnappers struck her several times on the head and stabbed her in the neck, causing her to fall to her knees. However, these wounds were not fatal, and Lola continued to resist. It is likely that she also screamed loudly, trying to attract the attention of other vacationers or beach vendors. In an attempt to silence Lola, they pressed her face into the sand. They pressed for too long, causing Lola to suffocate. The police believe that the motive for the crime was violence, although the assailants were unable to carry out their intended act and ended up killing her because they did not expect such fierce resistance from the teenage girl. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that Leonardo was previously tried for a case very similar to Lola's. That case occurred in 2009 when Leonardo was 26 years old. The victim was a 15-year-old girl, just like Lola. Leonardo followed her for several blocks before attacking her with a knife. He dragged the victim to a remote wooded area where he assaulted her. The Uruguayan police are convinced that at least 2 people were involved in the attack on Lola. Therefore, they charged Leonardo with aggravated murder and Angel with harboring a criminal. Jorge Base demanded a sentence of 10 years of imprisonment for Angel and 15 to 30 years for Leonardo. In June 2021, Angel, who had been in prison since 2019, was released by a judge's decision granting him conditional early release under oath. Despite psychiatric and psychological evaluations characterizing Angel as an aggressive and impulsive individual lacking impulse control, the judge found no grounds to accuse him of harboring a criminal, as harboring entails assisting the criminal after the crime has been committed. In this case, Angel should have been charged as an accomplice. Therefore, according to the judge, Angel Moreira's actions do not fall under the category of harboring. However, the prosecutor filed an appeal against the judge's decision, stating that Angel was present before, during, and after the crime. Despite their initial suspicions, Lola's parents, Adriana and Diego, trust the evidence presented by the police, agree that 2 suspects were involved in the crime, and hope for a swift verdict. On May 13, 2015, around 5 p.m., firefighters extinguished a raging fire in a garage by the roadside in the village of Sand Lake, Michigan. At that moment, a frightened woman ran up to their vehicle, shouting that her neighbors were dead. Several firefighters hurried with the woman to her neighbor's house. In the bedroom, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, were 2 lifeless bodies. It appeared that they had been shot. To preserve the evidence at the crime scene, the firefighters refrained from touching anything and immediately informed the police that they had found 2 bodies and required investigators and forensic experts. Forensic experts had been working at the crime scene for about an hour, collecting evidence and photographing the bodies of 46-year-old Martin Durham and 47-year-old Glenna Durham when one officer noticed a slight movement in Glenna's chest. Just a tiny bit. He rushed to her body and tried to feel for a pulse. But before he could touch her, Glenna's eyes opened wide, and she sat up abruptly, screaming, "What are you doing, Marty?" The officer immediately called for paramedics, who transported the injured woman to the local hospital. Marty and Glenna first met as teenagers in the early 1980s. Marty invited the girl on a date to a local open-air theater where they lost their virginity on the very same evening with little interest in the movie itself. Their relationship progressed quickly and passionately, but they broke up after a few months, partly because 17-year-old Glenna was married. Soon Marty started a family of his own. Christina Keller was 14 years old when she met 19-year-old Marty at a party held at his house. The young man seemed charming and fun to the girl, but also a little strange because he immediately declared that he would marry her someday. The next day, Marty showed up at her doorstep. Apparently, he made a favorable impression on Christina's parents because after that, he never left her life. Their friendship developed into a romantic relationship, and soon 16-year-old Christina discovered that she was expecting their first child. Within 2 years, she was carrying their second son, which prompted the young couple to get married. 11 months later, Christina gave her husband a daughter. Christina was 19 and Marty was 24 at the time. Initially, the young family lived with relatives, but in early 1995, Marty obtained a higher-paying job at a factory in Michigan, and the family of 5 moved there. However, on the evening of February 16, 1995, while returning from work, Marty was involved in a car accident. Another vehicle, speeding through a red light, collided with his car. The larger vehicle practically crushed Marty's car, trapping him inside. Marty was taken to the hospital, where he was in a clinically dead state for about 5 minutes. The left side of his body suffered severe injuries, and he remained in a coma for over 3 weeks. When he finally regained consciousness, he had no recollection of his wife, children, or much of his past life. He spent a year and a half learning to walk, speak, eat, and take care of himself again. Throughout this time, Christina supported him. Physically, Marty increasingly resembled his former self, but psychologically, he had changed. Due to the brain trauma, he experienced bouts of rage. He never raised his hand against his wife and children but became a domineering person. Even his sense of humor became darker. In 2000, almost 5 years after the accident, Christina filed for divorce. She still cared deeply for her husband, but her feelings had transformed into more of a maternal nature as she took on the role of his caregiver and could no longer relate to him in any other way. In May 2001, Marty purchased his first home using the funds he received from the insurance company, along with a bank loan. The house was located in the small village of Sand Lake, Michigan, where only 500 people reside. Marty was incredibly proud of his new home, where he moved in with his 2 sons and an African gray parrot named Bud. 2 months after moving into the house, Marty was surprised by a knock on his door from a 16-year-old girl who claimed to be his daughter. Marty asked who her mother was, and it turned out to be Glenna, his first love. The girl knew that her mother had had an affair early in her marriage, and she was born a few months later. She wanted to establish her paternity for certain. A DNA test confirmed that the girl was indeed Marty's biological daughter, born out of wedlock. This revelation led to the rekindling of Marty and Glenna's relationship, despite Glenna still being married. Clearly, Glenna had never been able to forget Marty, as she had a tattoo with his name on her arm throughout her marriage. Glenna divorced her husband and moved in with Marty. They were very happy together and soon had a new wedding ceremony. Glenna's new husband meant everything to her. The couple spent all their time together, visiting family, and going to the local casino once or twice a week. Even when Marty went hunting, Glenna would sit in the car and read a novel. Officially taking on the responsibility of caring for her husband, Glenna received $3,200 per month for her services. Marty's disability benefits amounted to over $1,000 per month. Additionally, Glenna sold excess medication from Marty, so their monthly income was approximately $5,000. When Marty's sons moved out, this income was sufficient for their life in the small village. However, by 2010, Marty's health, both mental and physical, had deteriorated significantly. The couple continued to spend all their time together and with their friends, including Connie and Keith Ream, another neighboring couple. On Monday, May 11, 2015, Marty offered to mow the lawn in Connie and Keith's backyard. He enjoyed doing this work and did it completely free of charge. Later that evening, all four of them, Connie, Keith, Marty, and Glenna, sat on the neighbor's terrace, and the Durhams returned home around 9 p.m. The next day, on Tuesday, at 8:26 a.m., Keith sent Marty a message asking how he was feeling, but he didn't receive a response. This was strange because Marty always promptly answered calls and messages. Throughout the day, Keith sent several more messages to his friend with the same result. Later that day, Connie approached the neighbor's door and knocked. She heard the Shelby family's dog barking, but no one opened the door. Keith even sent a joking message to Glenna saying, "What did you do to Marty?" Of course, she didn't respond to him either. On Wednesday, at 7:30 a.m., Connie approached the neighbor's house again and rang the doorbell. The only response she received was the dog barking. She walked around the house, checking if any doors or windows were open. Everything was locked as usual. Throughout the day, Connie and Keith tried to contact their neighbors, becoming increasingly worried. After work, around 4:30 p.m., Connie approached the neighbor's house for the third time and knocked. She was sure she would have to break the door, but to her surprise, when she touched the handle, she discovered that the door was not locked this time. Connie cautiously opened the door and called out for the neighbors. But at the door, she was only met by the Shelby family pet, who led her into the living room where there was a gruesome mess. Documents and photographs were scattered everywhere, a broken lamp and other items were in disarray. Following Shelby into the bedroom, Connie found the homeowners lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Marty was only in his underwear, while Glenna was fully dressed, with her legs covered by a blanket. Connie rushed out of the neighbor's house and ran towards a fire truck she noticed further down the road. Marty was not as lucky as his wife. 5 bullets that hit his back, forearm, and chest left him no chance of survival. He had been dead for several days. Glenna was shot twice, with both shots hitting the area behind her right ear. Blood was found not only in the bedroom, but also on the chair in the living room and on a pillow with 2 bullet holes. Underneath the chair, a gun and 2 empty shells were found. In the bedroom, there were 5 more shell casings, 1 near the door and 4 near Marty's body, totaling 7 in total. However, the gun found near the chair was designed for 6 bullets. This means that the perpetrator found time to reload the gun before continuing the shooting. Apart from the living room and bedroom, the rooms in the house appeared completely normal. There were no signs of forced entry, and in the kitchen, there was a bowl of spaghetti and a piece of garlic bread on the table. Later that same evening, when Glenna was taken to the hospital, Marty's children were allowed to take the family pets, a dog and a parrot, and bring them to their mother's house, Christina. Although the children were only permitted to take the pets, the trio did not miss the opportunity to search the house and discovered a sealed envelope with the word personal written on it. Inside, they found letters from Glenna addressed to her children and ex-husband. In the letters, she expressed her love for the children and asked for their forgiveness for not being the best mother. She also asked her ex-husband to take care of the children. Additionally, in Glenna's drawer, they found a packet of unpaid bills. They handed over all the findings to the police. The investigators began questioning the family's relatives and friends about their relationships and financial situation. They loved spending time together and were truly absorbed in each other's company. However, it soon became clear that they were facing serious financial difficulties. Glenna was in charge of the family's accounts, and relatives believed that Marty was unaware of the severity of their situation because he was quite frugal. On the other hand, Glenna had developed a serious addiction to gambling. She would spend hundreds of dollars on lottery tickets and lose thousands of dollars at the casino. But whenever her husband approached her, she would pretend to be playing with $1 bills. She played every week, and in 2010 alone, Glenna spent $75,000 on her addiction. The family had fallen behind on tax payments, had credit card debt, and Marty's car was on the verge of being repossessed. However, the most pressing issue was their home. Glenna hadn't made mortgage payments for over a year, and they had accumulated a debt of $48,000. In early April 2015, a few weeks before the attack on the family, Marty's mother saw a list of homes that would be seized due to debts, and Marty's address was listed there. She called Glenna, who assured her that the newspaper had printed the wrong address and that she would sort it out. Of course, it turned out that their home was indeed being taken away. Despite the fact that Marty had taken out the mortgage, on April 28th, Glenna received a notice that their home would be auctioned if they didn't pay $5,000. Interestingly, the auction was scheduled for May 12th, just a day before Marty and Glenna were found by their neighbor. The investigators concluded that Marty was unaware of the impending loss of their home because he had been renovating it for the past 2 months. Just 2 days before their deaths, he had painted the bathroom. After 3 days in the intensive care unit, Glenna regained consciousness. She had no recollection of the day of the murders or the preceding days. She couldn't even remember writing the letters to her children and ex-husband. Since the eyewitness couldn't provide any helpful information, the police had few leads or clues to work with. The weapon contained multiple DNA samples, as Marty was an avid hunter and often showed his firearms to friends. However, Glenna and Marty also sold drugs, for which they received cash payments, and large sums of money were stored in envelopes in a safe. Could this have been an unplanned robbery? The living room was in disarray, as if someone had been searching for something, and the cash from the safe was indeed missing. This version of events seemed the most plausible, but finding the killer among the clients of their illegal activities was like looking for a needle in a haystack. A whole year passed before an unexpected witness helped solve the case. It was a 19-year-old parrot named Bud, who had been living with Christina for the past 12 months. Bud was an African grey parrot and had the unique ability of not only mimicking sounds and words he heard in his environment, but also imitating human voices. Originally, he was Christina's beloved pet, but Marty took him, presumably as a way to get back at his ex-wife for leaving him. Upon returning to his beloved owner, Bud started reproducing various conversations he had heard while living with Marty, such as how Marty played with the dog. But at some point, he began repeating an argument between a man and a woman. They were clearly arguing with each other, raising their voices and occasionally mixing profanity with regular words. And at the end of the dialogue, a male voice shouted clearly, "No, no, don't shoot." Christina recorded this scene performed by the parrot on video but didn't report it to the police, thinking it would be laughed off. However, when a local journalist interviewed Marty's mother a year after his murder, she mentioned the video. The journalist became very interested and aired it on the news. The video quickly went viral, and the increased public attention forced the police to reopen the case and focus their attention on one suspect, Glenna Durham. They examined Marty and Glenna's phones and discovered that the last thing Marty did on his phone was search for information about lawnmowers on the evening of the 11th, after they returned home from the neighbors. The examination of Glenna's phone turned out to be much more intriguing. It had been used until the 13th, the day the bodies were found. From 3:32 a.m. to 4:48 a.m., someone used the phone 5 times to find information about the gun used in the shootings, including how to reload it. The last message was sent to Glenna's mother at 4:48 a.m. and said, "I love you, forgive me." Glenna was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She insisted on her innocence, and her lawyer tried to prove that another family member or a stranger had broken into the house to steal medication, cash, or Marty's weapons. However, the forensic experts did not find any signs of forced entry into the house. And what about the money from the safe? It turned out that Marty's children had taken it while they were searching the house when Glenna was taken to the hospital and their father to the morgue. When investigators accidentally learned about this, they stated that nobody had asked them about the money at the police station, so they didn't say anything. In any case, the version of a robber was discarded because nothing was stolen. The prosecution's version of events painted a much more plausible picture. Here's what they believed happened. Since Marty was in his underwear, he could have been killed on the morning of the 12th. The man must have learned about the inevitable loss of the house, became very upset, and a heated argument ensued. When Glenna grabbed the weapon, Marty turned and tried to run into the bedroom. She shot him in the back. Marty was still on his feet, reaching for another weapon in the bedside table. Glenna fired again, hitting his forearm. Only then did he turn to face her, and she sent 3 more bullets into his chest. Marty fell lifeless on the bedroom floor. Glenna spent the whole day doing paperwork. She wrote letters to her ex-husband and children and prepared spaghetti for lunch. When the neighbor showed up at her house for the first time on the evening of the 12th, Glenna was still engaged in these activities. Understanding that the neighbors would start to worry about her and Marty, no matter what Glenna planned, she needed to act quickly. She settled into a chair in the living room, placed a pillow against her head, and fired. However, nothing happened. The pillow absorbed the force of the shot, and the bullet barely grazed her. Since it was the last bullet in the pistol, she had to look up online how to reload it. This means she did not attempt it again until the early morning of the 13th when she sent a message to her mother. Perhaps she still had doubts when Connie knocked on the door again at 7:30 a.m. because the door was still locked. But when Connie left, Glenna must have unlocked the door, sat in the chair, took the pillow, and tried again. This time the injury turned out to be more serious, but as her doctor later explained, she did not hit any important veins, arteries, or penetrate the skull. It's hard to imagine what state she was in, but since head wounds always bleed profusely, she may have decided that she would simply bleed out. She made her way to the bedroom, where her husband's body had been lying all this time, and collapsed on the floor, covering her legs with a blanket. Whether she staged the scene when the police officer touched her or only regained consciousness at that moment is unknown. And we may never know because Glenna continues to claim memory loss. The jury believed the prosecution's version. On Wednesday, July 19, 2017, after 9 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty of murder. Glenna Durham was sentenced to life imprisonment. Of course, the parrot named Badder was not invited to court as a witness. And it's not because he swears terribly. It's simply impossible to prove that he didn't hear that particular dialogue on a TV show or the radio, not to mention how he could take an oath in the witness stand. In other words, if Badder had participated in the process and less than 24 hours had passed since Glenna's guilty verdict, her lawyer would have filed an appeal. On February 19, 2001, at the Battlebridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offences. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, Anne made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous, and he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, and thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, thick, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children, they were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John never again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control, and her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney, the police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her. But both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, the man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, found and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown, but it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, he blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4th, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had, so she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, after serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful Blom, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture. And their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, his earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. but they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again, and her name was Delia Baymer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Delia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with one past murder, one attempted murder, and at least one future murder. Delia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Delia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Delia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Delia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Delia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all 3. Not knowing what to do with them, he sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Delia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Delia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Delia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Delia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Delia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Delia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Delia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Delia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Delia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Delia Bamer would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Delia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging, but their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Delia Bamer had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police added their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Swine. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence he knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night" in Vienna depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. Two poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and two hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Swine as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly two women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Swinney is too dangerous to ever be released again. Late spring of 1995, Aurora, 26 years old, and Mark, 32 years old, chose the beautiful Corsican island for their honeymoon. Aurora and Mark got married 2 months ago, and the girl picked this place for their first vacation together. The young wife wanted to explore Corsica, its mountains, villages, and picturesque landscapes. On that day, they stopped in the cozy little town of Calvi. Here, the newlyweds had a candlelit dinner in the harbor at a restaurant overlooking the bay. After dinner, Aurora and Mark headed towards the Notre Dame de la Serra Chapel. It is a popular spot among tourists where lovers go to enjoy the sunset. An ideal place for a romantic end to the day. Later in the evening, around 10:30, they got into the car to return to the hotel. The young couple had to drive on a very dangerous road that sharply descended. And right at the point where the railing ended, some animal suddenly jumped onto the road in front of the car. Mark quickly turned the wheel, and the car went off the cliff. Despite the extreme situation, Aurora didn't panic. She opened the door and jumped out of the car just before it fell. Mark wasn't as fortunate. He plummeted 140 meters along with the car. Aurora was in shock, but she was alive. She made a daring decision. In the middle of the night, in pitch darkness, she descended barefoot to help her husband. Aurora found Mark in the car and pulled him out. She dragged him by the legs towards the sea and washed his face. Then, the girl climbed back up the cliff to stop a passing car and call for help. The firefighters from Calvi 1 arrived at the scene. Aurora was in hysterics, screaming and crying that her husband was down there with a head injury and unconscious. She begged the rescuers to descend as quickly as possible and save him. The firefighters immediately headed towards the base of the cliff to find Mark, but the darkness of the night and the uneven terrain significantly hindered their search. It took them half an hour just to locate the car. It turned out to be empty. However, they noticed a lot of blood and signs indicating that the man had a severe head injury. After several hours of relentless searching, the exhausted firefighters were ready to give up when, at 6 a.m., divers signaled that they had found something. Mark's body was floating in the water right next to the car at a depth of 3 meters. They brought his body to the surface. Unfortunately, it was too late for the newlywed. The police compiled a report on another unfortunate incident on that stretch of road and closed the case. Mark's body was transported to his native Belgium. The young widow was utterly devastated. She couldn't cope with the grief on her own, and she was hospitalized in a specialized clinic for several days. Mark's relatives rushed to console her, but she shut herself off from the world, declaring that she didn't want to see anyone. Mark's family understood her state of mind and didn't insist. After all, at the age of 26, she had lost her husband during their honeymoon. But in the following days, her behavior intrigued Mark's family more and more. Gradually, concern gave way to suspicion. Aurora insisted on having her husband cremated, but his parents vehemently opposed the idea. On the day of the funeral, she shocked the family even further by leaving the farewell ceremony earlier than expected. Since then, the relationship between her and Mark's family became increasingly complicated. Upon returning to the family home, she changed the locks and didn't even let her mother-in-law, who had come to collect a few of her son's inexpensive but sentimental belongings, inside. In the following weeks, Aurora put the house up for sale. The sale of the house provided her with a sum equivalent to 125,000 euros. But that wasn't all. It turned out she had received 7 insurance payouts after her husband's death. In total, Aurora received 475,000 euros. Shocked by such behavior from their daughter-in-law, the Van Ba couple decided to take legal action and filed a complaint regarding the suspicious death, prompting the coroner to demand an investigation into the circumstances of Mark's death. To understand what actually happened that evening, investigators began by studying the lives of the couple. Approximately a year before the incident, in April 1994, 31-year-old Mark Van Ba was working at a respected financial company in Brussels. He had a wonderful job, loving parents, and friendly colleagues, and it seemed like everything in his life was going well, or almost everything. However, he had not yet met a woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. Mark was at the age when he wanted to start a family. Mark and Aurora met at a bar in Brussels. At that time, Aurora was going from door to door selling ironing boards. It was not a very profitable job. The chemistry between Mark and Aurora was instant. Mark immediately fell in love with the beautiful girl and was crazy about her. The men's friends were envious and amazed by their vibrant relationship. Aurora was very attractive, fit, and sporty, while Mark was slightly overweight, not interested in sports, and quite shy. Yet, just a few weeks after their first meeting, Aurora moved in with Mark. The future husband's family warmly welcomed her, seeing that their son was happy with her and accepting her as their future daughter-in-law and the mother of their grandchildren. No one was surprised when the young couple decided to get married after a year. The girl set several conditions for her future husband, such as asking Mark to put half of the house in her name. This might have seemed unusual or inappropriate, but Mark, deeply in love, agreed to all of the bride's terms. On March 11, 1995, the young couple said yes to each other. The husband's entire family attended the wedding, while only the bride's twin sister was present from her side. Gradually, the husband's family began to notice that their daughter-in-law never talked about her family, evasively answering all questions about her relatives, her past, or her education. she pretended to come from a more privileged family than theirs. On September 5, 1996, more than a year after Mark's death, Aurora was invited to the police station for questioning. She confirmed the statements she had previously made. She and Mark had visited a restaurant in the port and then went to a chapel. On the way back, a wild animal suddenly jumped in front of their car. Mark turned the steering wheel, and an unfortunate accident occurred. Right before the car fell off the cliff, Aurora opened the door and jumped out. The police were unable to extract any further information from her. In an attempt to uncover the truth, Mark's body was exhumed on October 8, 1996. The forensic expert noted that some of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Numerous wounds were found on the body, but none were bleeding. This indicates that Mark died before the car fell off the cliff. The police wanted to question the widow again, but could not locate her anywhere. The detectives then decided to investigate the crime scene in Corsica. 2 years after the incident, Belgian police officers found themselves at the edge of the ravine where the newlyweds' car had plunged. Without the car, and armed only with photographs, the task became more challenging. Nonetheless, the expert was able to reconstruct the trajectory of the car before the fall. When something happens on the road, like an animal unexpectedly running out, a person reacts by turning the steering wheel but not by a full 90 degrees. If the car veered off the road, it should have fallen into the water, and under no circumstances could it have ended up where it was found. Additionally, the expert noticed another inconsistency with the accident theory. According to the firefighters who arrived at the scene, the bushes growing on the top of the cliff were crushed. If the car had quickly descended, the bushes would have been severed. The crushed vegetation indicated that the car had stayed on the bushes for some time before slowly rolling down. Furthermore, between the car and the water, after the incident, drops of blood were found that were unevenly distributed, suggesting that the body was carried, not dragged. Could Aurora, weighing less than 50 kilograms, have carried an 80 kilograms man? The findings of the investigation did not align with Aurora's version of events. The experts' conclusions were definitive. The car was pushed off the cliff. Now, the investigators wanted to understand what happened after the incident. Did Aurora descend to health Mark? Did she find the strength and courage to climb down the rocks barefoot? As difficult as it may be to believe, it was possible. Aurora Martin was a champion rock climber, a trained athlete, so the police couldn't easily refute the possibility that she actually descended to help her husband. It was a dead end for them. Still having no news about the young woman, the investigators decided to delve deeper into her past. Who is she really? What secrets does she hide behind her evasive answers? In reality, the girl had a very difficult childhood where there was no place for a loving family or a proper education. When she was 12 years old, her parents divorced and her mother moved to Germany, and the daughter rarely saw her. She lived a carefree life with her father and 2 sisters. Her father was hardly involved in her life, and when the girl turned 18, she left her childhood home with grandiose dreams. Aurora wanted to become a model and participated in beauty contests, but without much success. So, she found work as a hostess in a bar, sometimes working as a model for an escort service. In February 1993, Aurora was 24 years old and lived life to the fullest, leveraging her beauty. One fine day, as usual, she went to a rock climbing club where a fateful encounter awaited her. Peter Schuett. He was rich, young, handsome, and shared her passion for mountaineering. He was 23 and she was 24. It was love at first sight. Next to Peter, Aurora was able to turn the page on her past life. This story seemed too miraculous to be true. Indeed, while investigating Peter's past, the investigators uncovered an unusual fact for a young man of his age. Peter Schmidt was a widower. His wife had died under suspicious circumstances. It happened 2 years prior when Peter turned 21 and was serving in the German army stationed in Belgium. Peter enjoyed frequenting clubs, and one evening, While hanging out with friends, he met a young student named Ursula Deschamps. Their romance was fast-paced, and within 3 months, Peter put a ring on her finger. However, Ursula quickly discovered that Peter couldn't be satisfied with just one woman. There were other surprises awaiting her. Ursula found large sums of cash and forged documents at their home. She wanted to report her findings to the police. Tensions grew in their young marriage, and they decided to get a divorce. But on the evening of August 29, 1992, Peter and Ursula got into a convertible and set off on a trip during which Peter was supposed to teach his wife how to drive. It was a strange outing for soon-to-be ex-spouses. Peter was behind the wheel and, as usual, driving very fast. He lost control, and the car plunged into a canal at high speed. Peter managed to escape in time but couldn't save his wife, who drowned along with the car. He recalled that he even touched her hand and couldn't hold on to her to pull her to the surface. Ursula's body was found several days later. The autopsy revealed nothing that would cast doubt on the fact that the girl drowned. The police reconstructed the crime scene, and Peter convincingly demonstrated how he had escaped from the car through the rear window. Ursula's family, however, never believed it was an unfortunate accident. Firstly, it was a convertible, and Peter had never lowered the top before. Secondly, Ursula was an excellent swimmer. According to an expert who later analyzed the case, Ursula had time to escape from the car as drowning doesn't occur instantly but takes around 3 minutes as the water fills the vehicle. However, the Belgian police treated it as an unfortunate accident caused by the negligence of the driver. The young widower was sentenced to 3 months in prison, and the case was closed. 2 cases, 2 crime scenes, and 2 scenarios between which investigators couldn't help but notice coincidences. In both cases, there was a road accident, the driver lost control, and the car ended up in the water. One of the spouses managed to escape from the car in time, while the body of the other was not found in the car. Now detectives urgently needed to find Aurora and Peter, as they became the main suspects in the case of Mark Van Ber's death. Detectives also suspected Peter of Ursula's murder, but since Peter had served 3 months in connection with that case, it was possible to forget about prosecuting him again for the same crime. Meanwhile, the police learned why Ursula probably died and why Peter became so wealthy. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout equivalent to 115,000 euros. This allowed him to leave the army and seduce the beautiful Aurora. Their romance lasted for a year. But in early 1994, for unknown reasons, the young couple separated. It was during this time that the girl registered with a marriage agency. She described the ideal man as wealthy, with his own apartment, not overweight, and pleasant. April 1994 marked the beginning of her relationship with Mark Van Ber. 4 months after their meeting in August 1994, the girl insured Mark. Interestingly, Mark was obviously unaware of this because the documents bore not his signature, but Aurora claimed that his hand was injured, and she signed the documents for him. Soon, an unfortunate incident occurred. Aurora sold the house, received the insurance payout, and disappeared. However, she didn't stay hidden for long. 2 months after Mark's murder, investigators found her trace in Luxembourg. She opened a bank account to deposit an amount equivalent to 475,000 euros. 2 individuals had access to the account, herself and a certain Peter Schlitt. The 2 reunited and moved to Miami, Florida. For almost 2 years, the lovers lived a life of luxury. Luxurious apartments, cars, and a yacht. Until a major French newspaper published an article calling them diabolical lovers and described the suspicions the police had against them. Aurora and Peter became extremely cautious. They changed their appearance and only made calls from telephone booths. They managed to hide for some time until Peter was arrested in a supermarket parking lot. He had around $50,000 with him and offered it to the police in exchange for his release, but they refused. 2 days later, the police arrested Aurora in the apartment where the lovers were hiding. Peter and Aurora did everything possible to avoid extradition. However, on December 3, 1998, they were returned to Belgium. Aurora immediately refused to give any testimony. Peter, on the other hand, spoke a lot, but little of what he said was true. Since they clearly did not want to cooperate with the investigation, the police did not have solid evidence against them. The course of the case changed due to an anonymous phone call. A woman called and revealed that she had information about Marc's murder. Later, the police identified the woman as Fabienne Lefebvre. Fabienne was Aurora's stepmother, but she had recently separated from the girl's father and decided to either seek revenge or clear her conscience. Fabienne claimed that after the tragedy in Corsica, she rushed to the hospital to comfort her stepdaughter. However, she was met by a completely different girl, not grieving at all. According to Fabienne, Aurora confessed everything to her. She stated that Peter was behind it all and that he took care of everything. When Aurora and Marc were driving on the road, Peter and 3 accomplices, his friends from Germany, stopped the car. They beat Marc with baseball bats. According to Fabienne, Marc never knew until the end who betrayed him because he begged the men to spare his wife and let her go. When the beating was over, they put Marc's body in the car and pushed it off a cliff. However, the police failed to find the accomplices or prove their existence because it didn't match Peter's character. Additionally, there were many doubts about the truthfulness of Fabienne's words. Firstly, Fabienne and Aurora had a strained relationship, and secondly, why didn't she go to the police earlier and why did she make an anonymous call? The woman claimed that she was afraid. However, the police were convinced that building a solid case based solely on Fabienne's words was not possible and sought other evidence. In Germany, the police found postcards from Corsica and photographs of the crashed car that went off the cliff in the possession of one of Peter's brothers. They were souvenir snapshots, but the intriguing part was that they were taken 6 months before Marc's murder. Was it a coincidence or careful preparation? Despite the fact that 4 years had passed since the murder, the details of the crime remained a mystery. On June 16, 1999, the police decided to reconstruct the crime scene at the airport. The driver was driving the car at a speed not exceeding 35 kilometers per hour. Aurora was supposed to open the car door wide, as if trying to jump out. She failed to do so, even when the car significantly reduced its speed. She became angry, cried, and had hysterical outbursts, trying to find an explanation for her failure. Peter intervened, attempting to defend Aurora. It is unclear why he was participating in the reconstruction at all since, theoretically, he was not present during the crime in Corsica. After this experiment, the investigators were convinced that Marc Van Ber did not die as a result of an accident but was murdered. The trial began. The defendant's lawyers proposed a new version of events. Allegedly, Marc suffered a heart attack just before falling from a height. In other words, he died a few seconds before the accident, and therefore all the injuries he sustained afterwards became post-mortem. This was a hypothesis that could undermine the entire theory of prosecution. Even the forensic expert considered it a clever move, but such a version did not correspond to the autopsy results. Furthermore, during the trial, the forensic expert revealed another extremely important detail. Marc hadn't eaten anything for several hours before the crime. He was hungry. The fact that Aurora even lied about the romantic dinner with her husband that evening was the final straw for the jurors. They found both of them guilty. Aurora was sentenced to 15 years and Peter to 20 years. It is unlikely that they served even half of their sentences. They were released long ago. Despite Peter being deported to Germany and Aurora being prohibited from leaving the country, as of 2021, they were still together. Peter found work as a carpenter, and thanks to her fluency in several languages, Aurora works. The most remarkable thing about this case is that Aurora and Peter committed 2 almost perfect murders. And the second crime would undoubtedly have gone unnoticed if Aurora had been a little more patient and hadn't slammed the door in front of her husband's family. If she had remained the same pleasant girl they knew, she would have calmly left after a few months, and the Van B family would never have suspected her of anything. November 4th, 1989. A quiet night in the fashionable district of Daytona Beach, Florida. Only the lights on the porch illuminate the extravagant mansions, whose occupants have long gone to sleep. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by police sirens after a desperate call was received at the rescue service at 4:54 from the Fotopoulos family's house. In the bedroom on the second floor, officers found a man holding his wounded wife to his chest. Another man lay motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Members of the small but influential Greek community in the city, Costa and Lisa Fotopoulos, along with Lisa's mother and brother, lived in a huge white mansion on the banks of the Halifax River. The officers were met by Lisa's brother, who led them to the bedroom on the second floor. 26-year-old Lisa Fotopoulos was alive but in agony. She had been shot, and the bullet had entered her head, although hope was not yet lost as it had not penetrated her brain. It struck her forehead, deflected off a bone, and came to a rest just above her left eye. While it was still a gunshot wound, and the medics couldn't know the extent of the damage until she was examined at the hospital, they believed she had a chance to survive. They rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible. As for the young man lying on the floor, there was nothing that could be done for him. Costa had shot the intruder who attacked his wife, emptying the entire magazine into him. While Lisa was being rushed to the hospital and newspapers competed to write about the hero who shot the robber, saving his wife and family, the police began investigating the botched robbery. However, it didn't take long for suspicions to arise among the investigators. On the first floor of the house, they found a broken window, indicating the intruder had entered through it. But the window was too small for a sturdy man to fit through without cutting himself. It was also too far from the door handle to open it in such a manner. Furthermore, despite the presence of crystal, silverware, electronics, and artwork in the house, the stranger hadn't touched anything and went straight to the bedroom where he shot Lisa. This raises the question of why her instead of first eliminating the main threat, the husband. Even before morning arrived, the investigators decided to take a closer look at this case and at Lisa's husband. Konstantinos or Costa Fotopoulos grew up in Athens, Greece, in a wonderful family. His father held a prominent position as one of the directors of the Greek airline. Since childhood, Costa dreamed of moving to the United States, where he believed a better life awaited him, a life filled with sports cars, big houses, and beautiful women. At the age of 18, he enrolled in Daytona University, where he studied aviation management. To cover his expenses, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. It was there that he was introduced to Lisa. Even in the modern world, traditional values still hold importance, and every Greek family in the USA wants to marry their child to someone from Greece, a person with the same faith and cultural heritage. Costa seemed to be the ambitious and intelligent Greek guy that parents wanted to see as Lisa's husband. The young woman was captivated by the charm of this young man. He too was impressed, but not by her beauty or intelligence, but by the state of her family. Within a few months, the couple became engaged, followed by a joyous Greek wedding. Costa and Lisa appeared to be an ideal couple. After a few years, Lisa's father passed away, leaving her and her brother in charge of the family business, a theme park and several souvenir shops. Costa worked for her mother, and her brother for $300 a week. It was a decent amount for those times, but not a fortune. Soon, Costa decided to start his own business, something he could fully control. The man took money from his wife and opened a billiard club. For a long time, Lisa had no idea how things were going at the bar and that her husband preferred to hire young kids who, for various reasons, ended up on the streets. Costa surrounded himself with teenagers who were unable to say no to him. He enjoyed portraying himself as a powerful, successful man and would tell the young people that he worked for the CIA, carrying out various government missions. And if any of the kids had doubts about the truthfulness of Costa's words, he had evidence. Framed and hanging on the office wall was a letter from the CIA addressed to Costa. However, if someone bothered to read the letter, they would discover that it was simply a job rejection. Fortunately for Costa, the teenagers believed him unquestioningly, and for them, it was 100% proof that their boss was a secret agent. Things reached a point where Costa invited his business partner, Tony Calderoni, on one of his nocturnal outings. Tony, who didn't believe his friend's tall tales, decided to join him out of curiosity. As a result, he watched with suspicion as Costa, dressed head to toe in camouflage, buried a bag with weapons and money in the woods. The bar trapped Costa in a debt hole. He already owed $20,000, but still continued to enjoy life, playing the role of a super agent. Then, on a beautiful day in 1989, his life became even better after meeting the luxurious 20-year-old Deidre Hunt, who entered his establishment in search of work. Costa was captivated by the beauty of the girl, and soon a romance ensued between them. They didn't care about the 10-year age difference or the fact that Costa was married. Deidre turned out to be the complete opposite of Lisa. Lisa was a true lady, while Deidre was a forbidden fruit, full of passion and desire, something that Costa wasn't getting at home. In turn, he became a source of admiration and expensive gifts for her, providing everything she was lacking in life. Deidre grew up in poverty. She didn't know her father, and her mother suffered from several mental disorders, including multiple personalities, specifically 11 different personalities. The girl never knew what awaited her at home when she returned from school, whether her mother would beat her or shower her with affection. And she had no choice because it was her mother. When Deidre was 7 years old, a neighbor began to harass her, abusing her when she was 11 and he was 31. Instead of support, she only received indifference from her mother. The woman didn't work, spending all the money on alcohol. The situation was worsened by the fact that Deidre had to wear orthopedic braces on her legs to walk properly, and her classmates, sensing Deidre's vulnerability, bullied the ugly duckling. However, everything changed after a few years. She no longer needed the braces, and the girl transformed into a beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an attractive figure. She began to receive a lot of attention from men. For Deidre, who had never heard a kind word at her address, it was a kind of drug. She indulged in it fully. At the age of 18, she got involved with a bad crowd and was arrested for armed robbery. After her release, the girl decided to start afresh, and in September 1989, she set off to Daytona Beach, where she could get lost among many street youths. But Deidre didn't get lost. She had charisma and beauty. She quickly became one of the highlights of the bar, strolling around in a black bikini and captivating the regulars. Deidre's difficult childhood and arrest didn't deter Costa. On the contrary, he saw in her a vulnerable girl whom he could manipulate, just like other teenagers hanging out in the bar. Costa rented an apartment for Deidre 2 blocks away from her work so they could meet at any time. And out of habit, he fed the naive girl stories about his work for the CIA and how he had killed 8 people and so on. Of course, Lisa quickly discovered that her husband was seeing the waitress. She followed him to the rented apartment, confirmed the truth, and demanded that he end the affair. However, he stubbornly denied everything. Then the proud Greek woman threatened to divorce him. Costa couldn't allow that because in the case of a divorce, he would not only be left penniless but also burdened with debts. Interestingly, this conversation took place just a few weeks before an unknown person attempted a nighttime visit to their home. Costa told the police that on the evening of November 4th, he and his wife were watching movies late into the night before going to sleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to a deafening sound. Opening his eyes, he saw the silhouette of an armed man looming over his wife. Almost instinctively, he grabbed the weapon he kept for self-defense, rolled onto the floor, and emptied the entire magazine at the intruder. Miraculously, the bullet had narrowly missed Lisa's brain, and she not only quickly regained consciousness but also was able to speak. She confirmed her husband's account of them going to bed late and waking up in pain when he was talking on the phone with emergency services. However, Lisa added a few other interesting details. She saw her husband burying a black sports bag in the backyard earlier that evening for some unknown reason. Furthermore, she recounted an incident that had occurred at her workplace just a week ago when someone had tried to rob her. A young man held a weapon to her and attempted to force her into a small office space. She managed to fall to the floor and crawl between his legs, escaping from him. Fortunately, he didn't pursue her. As detectives listened to her account, they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an attempt on Lisa Fotopoulos' life, incident number 1. So, who was the unfortunate intruder who broke into their home? It turned out to be an 18-year-old named Brian L. Chase. His father stated that his son had been missing for a while, getting involved with a bad crowd that frequented Costa Fotopoulos bar. As the media buzzed about the incident, the news reached the teenagers who frequented Co-Star's bar. A phone call came into the police, altering the course of the investigation. The call was from a 20-year-old named Newman Taylor. Taylor believed that the police would find it interesting to know that if Brian Chase was the one who died, he had been hired to kill the woman. Taylor was a friend of Deirdre, and a few weeks ago, she offered him $10,000 to kill Lisa. It was a tempting offer, but what stopped him was his knowledge of Costa. Taylor was certain that he wouldn't make it out of the Fotopoulos house alive because Costa had an arsenal of weapons stored there. He refused, realizing that his own death could be part of the plan. Now, when he read the news, he immediately understood what had happened. Brian was his friend, and he didn't want Deirdre and Costa to get away with it. He knew Brian wasn't the killer, but he was terribly afraid of Costa. He realized that both he and Brian were in danger. The investigators believed the witness because it aligned with what they observed at the crime scene. The police wanted to talk to Deirdre, and they got lucky. She showed up at the police station herself. She confirmed Taylor's words but claimed that the idea to kill Lisa belonged not to her but to her lover. Lisa had found out about her husband's affair and planned to divorce him. In the event of a divorce, Costa would be left bankrupt. But if Lisa died, he hoped to receive a $700,000 insurance payout. In addition to that, Deirdre revealed that the bar was actually a front for money laundering. Costa had a business partner in Greece who produced counterfeit banknotes. That's why he hired street teenagers who didn't ask too many questions. The FBI had suspicions about this, but they didn't have evidence yet. Deirdre admitted that besides Taylor, she approached at least 3 other teenagers with an offer to kill Lisa. The initial plan was to attack Lisa at a Halloween party. However, her friend Taja James, who agreed to carry out the task, got scared of the crowd surrounding the victim. The next incident was the one Lisa reported to the police. After Taja's failures, Deirdre persuaded Brian to commit the crime, promising him $5,000. He was supposed to stage a car accident and then shoot her in the head. But Brian's car simply wouldn't start. The next time he tried to break into the house, he was scared off by the neighbors. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to get close to Lisa. Costa disabled the alarm, so the young man entered the house unimpeded, walked straight into the bedroom, and shot the sleeping young woman. He was supposed to shoot again, but the gun jammed, and while he was struggling with it, Costa emptied his entire magazine into him. Costa had initially planned to kill Brian to appear as a hero. But when he realized his wife was alive, he and Deirdre started brainstorming how to finish the job. They decided to dress Deirdre as a nurse and deliver a bomb disguised as flowers to Lisa's ward. Fortunately, the police were guarding Lisa's room, and this plan also failed. Deirdre's story seemed so incredible that the investigators could barely believe it. But it didn't end there. In an almost casual tone, sipping on a Diet Cola and taking a drag from her cigarette, Deirdre claimed that she and Costa had killed before. Their victim was a young man, 19-year-old Mark Kevin Ramsey, who worked at Co-Star's bar. The young man knew about the money laundering, but, unlike most teenagers who kept their mouths shut, he believed he deserved a share. He threatened to blackmail Costa, and Costa fired him. However, supposedly impressed by the young man's audacity, Costa offered Kevin to join a secret club of hired assassins. According to his words, it was an elite group of trained killers who received thousands of dollars for complex tasks ordered by the CIA. Costa mentioned that all recruits had to undergo an initiation ritual. Kevin agreed and allowed himself to be taken to the woods and bound. Costa promised that he and Deirdre would simply shoot near his feet for a few minutes to make sure he wouldn't flinch and would be capable of such work. Suddenly, Costa gave Deirdre a signal and she shot Kevin 3 times in the chest. Because it wasn't Kevin's initiation, it was Deirdre's. Then she approached the young man, grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and shot him in the temple. After that, Costa took his AK-47 and fired a final shot into Kevin's head. Then they both left without even untying their victim. As a successfully completed initiation ritual, Costa gave Deirdre a black beret and promised to make a monogram for the secret club when she tracked down and killed the next target. Upon hearing this story, the investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a deranged person. The murder of a teenager whose disappearance wasn't even reported. Her words seemed too far-fetched to believe. To expose the liar, they asked her to lead them to Kevin's body. Without hesitation, Deirdre showed them the way. The poor boy's body still lay in the woods, where the lovers had left him, but that wasn't all. Deirdre made an even more significant statement that caused a sensation. She claimed the existence of a video capturing Kevin's execution. Initially, Deirdre was enthused about the recording, but then she realized that Costa would use it to keep her as his accomplice under control. Was the girl trying to portray her lover as a psychopath to protect herself? Or was there really a video that would lift the veil of secrecy over the hired assassins club? The investigators had to ascertain this. Costa, of course, denied everything, but upon obtaining a search warrant, the police found a cassette in his garage. It was a fully captured video of the teenager's murder. The boy screamed in pain and terror so intensely that the police officers in the room took a while to recover from what they had witnessed. But the crucial evidence in the recording was that Deirdre followed the instructions of a man behind the camera, a man with a distinct Greek accent. Simultaneously, the police unearthed the sports bag mentioned by Lisa. Inside were an AK-47 and the .22 caliber pistol, which the two had used during Kevin's murder. Deirdre Michelle Hunt and Konstantinos Fotopoulos were charged with the murder of Kevin, Brian, and the attempted murder of Lisa. During Deirdre's trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer, but during Co-Star's trial, they presented her as his victim, someone who believed in his fabrications about secret agents and an exclusive club of top-notch assassins. The prosecutors themselves admitted to perceiving Deirdre's role differently in this case and couldn't agree on the matter. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Deirdre's mother testified in her favor, confessing to mistreating her daughter when she was a child. Deirdre saw nothing but chaos in her life, so it's not surprising that she fell under Co-Star's influence. According to her testimony, Costa physically and psychologically tortured her, extinguished cigarettes on her, burned her with an iron, and committed other atrocities. An hour before the verdict was announced, she decided to admit her guilt in the crime to avoid the death penalty. However, the judge showed no sympathy towards her. Watching the video of Kevin's murder was enough for him to sentence her to death. Deirdre appealed based on the fact that while she was in prison, awaiting the opportunity to testify against Costa, her lawyer struck a deal with a television show to sell her interview for $5,000. Deceptively, he brought the filming crew to his client, claiming it was merely preparation for her testimony in court, but once there, he revealed they were journalists and persuaded her not to resist and to tell her story. The lawyer was banned from practicing law for a year as punishment. Deirdre's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Costa, who was also sentenced to death, filed appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He is still awaiting the execution of his sentence and possibly enjoying some attention by entertaining viewers with his tales about the CIA. Fortunately, even in this story, there are some positives. The doctors chose not to remove the bullet from Lisa's head, but she fully recovered and continues to lead a normal life, carrying on her father's work in Daytona Beach. She married a wonderful person and left behind the story with Costa and the 6 unsuccessful attempts on her life far behind her.